are broadcasting. The webinar is now broadcasting to all attendees.
So remember, you want to
All right.
wait for people to.
Yeah, for sure.
And you can view
Yep.
people coming in.
Yep. Right there.
Attendees.
All systems go.
Yeah.
So there you
All
go.
right.
And people start, commenting.
Yeah.
You can say,
All right. Hello, everybody,
wait, was that a good morning?
and good evening.
Oh, good evening.
Yeah.
Scott, Nelson. Hi, guys.
Hey, yeah. Good seeing everybody. You're probably sick of looking at that map. Probably sick of looking at me.
We had it on the boat. For those who didn't know.
Oh, that's true.
Right? We
Yeah.
had it on the boat.
Yeah. Mm.
Sergey, Pete.
Hartley and Krista, it's good to see everybody checking
Kasia,
in.
and I'm so sorry. I don't know how to say Blazej. So when we have our captain's hour, that's my name. It's been butchered my whole life.
So
Hartley,
just
Krista.
to remind everybody, we have Captain's Hour Monday at 7 Eastern Time, Eastern Daylight. So hopefully that's early enough for all of our European folks and not too early for our Australian folks. And anyway,
We got
it's 4 o'clock drinking time for
Dirk from Tasmania.
Dirk from Tasmania. Fantastic. Hello, Dirk. You're up early.
Hey, Werner and Becky.
And Werner and Becky are from Malta. They're up late. So anyway, yeah. So we've got
Wendy and Vera.
the usual crowd here. We have Bob from his boat in Manitowoc. We have Nathan and Vivian from their boat, actually from right across the room here. And Taji to my left. So the usual crowd.
Nathan and Vivian are literally docked 2 boats from us, so
Yeah.
it's almost the same distance right here.
Mm,
On Thursday, we'll be on the other side.
Linda.
mm.
Ram.
So.
Where's Ram? Linda says hi from Ram.
Ramp.
R-A-N-F. Where's Ram?
I wonder if that's meant
Oh,
to be.
Kasia, and geez, you're gonna have to give me a pronunciation there. From Scotland.
Ah, that's right. Yeah.
Langley, Maine.
Ah, from Maine. Nice.
Hi, Terry.
We have folks from all over tonight.
Daniel.
Mm. It's interesting. We have a really good
This is
turnout.
from Quincy. Hi, guys.
Good turnout. Yeah.
Terry's from Calgary. Blaze will do. All right, thank you.
So the beauty of Monday is we're going to all be unmuted, so you don't have to just listen to us talk. We're going to just have a good free-for-all and chat and have some nice wine. Nathan and Vivian have a Bordeaux over there.
No, it's a Via Real.
Oh, okay.
Spanish.
It's España. España. Nice.
I'm working on my rosé.
And I'm a non-drinking person tonight, just for
tonight.
just tonight. That's true. Mm,
Cheers, everybody.
yeah.
Sante.
I've got a particularly nice vitamin water.
Nice, Bob. Mm.
Bob actually makes the best mojitos and the best painkillers.
Bob makes among the best cocktails of all time.
Yeah.
So we were talking about cocktails earlier and whether or not we could put hail in our cocktails.
What do you think the logistics of that are, Bob? If you have a hailstorm, how they'll work in your cocktails?
Huh. Yeah, that'd be fine actually. That'd work nice.
So much for acid rain.
Exactly. Ice is ice, really.
Ice is ice,
It'll
yeah.
be okay.
Mm. So,
We actually collected some ice, John, for cocktails in the Chesapeake.
Bob,
on
I told that story tonight.
a return trip from somewhere. God awful store right
Yeah.
outside of Little Creek.
Yeah, that was with the common man and
And Glenn, the
And
uncommon
Glenn.
man.
And then I had the biblical messages on that trip.
Oh, okay, yep.
Yeah, that was an interesting.
And lots of
test.
hail.
And lots of hail. Yeah, yeah, it was
That's a long time ago.
that was, yeah. That was Super Chief, Hylas 49. Bob and I sailed it from Trinidad straight to the Chesapeake Bay. That was a long trip.
Yep.
Probably close. It's maybe 1,700 miles nonstop the route we came.
Yep.
Yeah. Good run. Yep. All right, everybody. I think then looks like we're gonna go ahead and get started. Thanks a million for coming. Come on over. Okay. Tonight's webinar is Force 10 Storm Sailing Strategies. So I will bring that up right now. Share screen.
Double click.
And we'll go live here. So, all right.
Let me just do this
Yeah.
for you here.
Yeah. Okay, perfect. That's better. Good. All right. Anyway, good evening, good morning. Thanks to everybody for coming. This is one of the really cool things about Zoom is we are spanning the world. And as I've said each webinar, and I certainly mean it from all my heart, thanks for turning up. Thanks for your support. Thanks for your questions. Bob and I were just talking, and Nathan as well, about we're going to have these things answered and out to you, we promise, soon. Other little business, Taji was busy getting all the webinar people organized for tonight. So the
I
Okay.
promise tomorrow for those who were on webinar 3 and even today's webinar 4, I will get those recordings out tomorrow. Too loud?
Yeah. So there we go. Okay.
I'm being told that it's a chest.
That's going to be the most popular part of the webinar. Now we really are like YouTubers. Sorry. Oh, that's terrible. Anyway, so tonight's program is Force 10 Storm Sailing. And the reality is that, hold on one sec, we are having some technical glitches. They're not moving.
You just do the first one like that, and then you're good to go.
Okay. Yikes. Anyway, there's my jet in action again. So this dude on the right, an Irish admiral, developed a system for measuring wind speed, wave height, and had these very interesting descriptions of what the ocean looked like and what land looked like during different wind speeds, and particularly for storms. And it's known as the Beaufort system, the Beaufort wind scale. When you're in the UK, you just hear it'll be like people will refer to wind just literally by the Beaufort number. It's, Beaufort 8, or it's just 8. And that implies that it's a full gale with winds to 34 to 40 knots. It's amazing. The system was developed in 1805 and is fundamentally still in use today. Force 10 is a tremendous amount of wind. And the description of it is almost a bit surreal. It almost sounds a little poetic, with high waves and overhanging crests, foam, and is in great patches and blown in dense white streaks along the direction of the wind. It doesn't sound anywhere near as terrifying as it really is. The good news is that Force 10 conditions are extremely rare, and you can sail around the world and avoid them without question. When you're in a Force 10 storm, you really know you're living and you're very alive, and your senses are heightened. This was a dear friend of mine who sadly passed away shortly after this picture was taken a long time ago, when we delivered a 71-foot ocean. It was an ocean catch, and we sailed from Newport, Rhode Island to Stockholm, Sweden. Nothing too exceptional about that, except that we left from Newport on January 25th, and we made a crossing of the North Atlantic in the middle of the winter. And we encountered 3 Force 10 or Force 10 plus storms on that passage. Anyway, Joe was a great man. But And you really know, you can tell a lot about somebody when they're smiling in force 10. But storms and gales, the reality is heavy weather is really rare. My mom and her partner, Tim, they sailed their Gin Fizz Epic around the world in the 80s. They were away for 4 years. They encountered one gale, one force 8 gale, and another short-lived near gale force 7 in 4 years. They did encounter plenty of tropical squalls, nasty thunderstorms, and all of that. The thing is, you have to differentiate between squalls, which are scary and can be dangerous for sure, but they're not gales or storms. What makes a gale, what makes a storm is our sustained storm force winds over a long period of time. And that's why they're so difficult. And that's why you're turning up for this webinar, to just get some ideas as to how you cope with them, because what they do is they grind you down. That's the thing about storms that are really different. Squalls scare the crud out of you, but then they go away. Storms just, they bring you down slowly. So me, I am not as lucky as my amazing mother. I have had, as you can see from this list, a lot of interesting storms over the years. It's funny, when I was compiling this, I thought to myself, God, you're stupid. How did you ever get involved in that many serious storms? And this is just, these is a list of the ones that I can remember. Of course, I've been sailing essentially for 40 years, every year without stopping, logging somewhere around 10,000 miles a year. So chances are you're going to get into a lot of gales, but it's really interesting looking at this list that many of them were from my previous life as a delivery captain. And as a delivery skipper, you basically have to go, or you do go, you're in a rush. And I gained a lot of really interesting experience from that. As looking at the list, it's funny because I was just thinking about the different strategies we're going to talk about tonight. In Hurricane Mitch, we did kind of classic, and we're going to talk about that particular storm story in great detail tonight. But we sailed a Hylas 46, and we hove to, we forereached, and we ran off all in the same storm. Hurricane Bob in the Atlantic, that was a weird, quick hurricane, and we just punched our way through it, forereaching. Typhoon Roy in the Pacific and an old Gulfstar 50, we ran before it with just a tiny little storm jib up. We ran off for that one. The Winter Crossing, that Ocean 71, we have, I think, several made the list from that, but the biggest storm was this Force 12, which is hurricane strength. And we were running before that. And I'll tell you some of the stories from that tonight as well. So tonight's webinar is filled with information, but it's also filled with stories. This is sort of more like my book, Serious Ocean. It's info and stories combined, because for me, the way you deal with storms, I remember them so clearly, but they all kind of take on a narrative form. We had an incredible storm in the North Sea in that Ocean 71. And we actually have pictures of this Force 10 tonight, a little video of our Contessa Gigi when we rounded the Horn. We actually have a picture of the night we capsized in the Contessa, a little video of that. I'm warning you right now, they're kind of grainy, but they were Super 8 video, Super 8 film taken back then, and it's pretty cool to see them. We've had a lot of good gales in Quetzal. Every time it says Kaufman 47, that's Quetzal. But anyway, I guess the point that I'm trying to make is, I'm not bragging, because really to get into that many storms, you're kind of an idiot. But I come at this program tonight with a degree of experience that is legitimate. So I always get a little weary when people say, oh, you can't forereach. Because I look at this list and I think, wow, we have forereached through a lot of storms over the years. We have hove to, which is preferred. We've run off. We even laid a hull a few times. So we've had a lot of experience in wind. And so like everything, this is a webinar, it's John Kretschmer, it's one man's opinion, but you can see it's based on some experience. And I'm still at it. Just last year, I saw that Tim and Gretchen are signed in tonight. We had a frontal passage to remember. If you look over at the Grib file there, you can see that is what a classic frontal passage looks like. There's winds coming from the north at 35, and honestly, they reached us at about 45. and it's right at the spot where the southwest winds at 20, 25 collided with the north wind at 35 to 45. That's where the front passed. Bob and I were in a storm like that years ago when we delivered a Beneteau 46 down to the Caribbean. It was very similar, and we got rocked by 70 knot winds. Frontal passages are really tricky to deal with, but unlike gales, they come and they blow fast, and then the wind kind of fills in from one direction, and they're not sort of these deep-seated low pressure systems. But we got rocked here. You can, in fact, this is a video. Hopefully it'll show up decently tonight of just from that trip on Quetzal last fall, just before we hit the front. How does it look? Is it? Yeah. You guys see it okay there? So hopefully, because we were testing some of these videos on the boat today where the Wi-Fi isn't as good. But anyway, we are forereaching here in about 25 knots, getting our sails really small. That's Andrew there helping trim the main. And if you look, we're watching, the water's just crashing over the deck. The seas were, what made that frontal passage really tricky was that we had already had 15-foot seas from the south when the north wind hit. So it was a pretty ugly experience, but aside from one tricky jibe where the main preventer saved our bacon, we handled it pretty well. So tonight's webinar, I'm going to try to pick the pace up so that I can get to more questions. I'm not going to promise that because I'm going to veer off into some stories. But we're going to talk a little bit about weather. This is not a weather workshop. That's an entire, we could spend 3 webinars on that. I'm going to talk about how weather relates to gales, where storms come from, what they look like. We're going to talk quite a bit about preparing for a gale when it comes. And then the heart of it are discussing the tactics that you employ. And then we're going to end the webinar up with 2 really detailed, kind of heartfelt, really scary storm stories. It's funny, a friend of ours, Kurt from Ontario, sent me an email after the Safety at Sea webinar saying, "Oh, this is great, John. You saved the scariest ones for last. This way nobody's going to want to go sailing." But remember the slide there, that storms are rare. And if you're prepared, and this is going to sound a little weird, but when you're in a gale, in a good boat, with a good plan, it's something of a privilege to watch nature when it's really pissed off, because you realize that the ocean is a wilderness, and it's one of the great wildernesses left. And so it's a place to really, I don't know, you feel very alive when you're there. So like usual, Bob is going to monitor and control the question and answers. So you can send them in throughout the webinar. We're going to get the book out to you, or the email out to you with all the questions and answers in it early next week. But fire off your questions throughout. Yeah, I was looking back at this. Was an old delivery. We're stranded in the Azores trying to rebuild a starter motor, and that's the life of a delivery captain right there. So we're going to start out tonight with weather observations. Again, I'm not going to go into the intricacies of pressure systems because that will kind of numb our heads a bit and also derail us from talking about how you cope with heavy weather. But some things that I've observed in my long career as a sailor. So to put it in perspective, I made my first passage to Bermuda in 1979. And I'm headed out to Bermuda with Nathan and Vivian in Ultima in October of this year. So, I mean, I've been at this a while. It's pretty clear to me that weather is less predictable than it used to be. Needless to say, it's one-man sample size, albeit a pretty big sample. But many other sailors who I respect tremendously, I had a long conversation with Trevor Robertson about this down in Grenada, who's, I think I told you last webinar, is clearly maybe the most accomplished small boat sailor ever. And he couldn't agree more. He couldn't agree with me more. But most importantly, the data from climate scientists is indisputable. The upshot is the prevailing winds are not as reliable as they used to be. tropical storms and winter storms are not as reliably constrained to specific time frames. That's sort of a wordy way of saying they happen all the time. I think, Richard, you're in Hong Kong. I think you guys have had tropical storms now every month of the year. You know, the southern Atlantic, Brazil had never had tropical storms at all at any recorded times, and now they've had several. And the storms that do occur are more intense and they last longer. So you're sitting on your boat, Brad, I saw that. And those of you sitting at home, you're going, oh man, this is great news. Fantastic. Well, there's a flip side to it. And the second round of weather observations is that weather forecasting and modeling, basically you have to think of it in terms of modeling these days. Specifically, the grid files you download from satellites are just remarkably accurate. You know, those old school sailors like me, and especially meteorologists who teach weather systems for sailors, have been really grumpy about grid files because they take a really complex subject and they simplify it. But if you don't know a lot about weather, you can start your learning process by just watching a procession of grid files, and you'll see how winds rotate around lows and highs. You can see frontal passages coming as they almost are spelled out in English. They're a really good place to start to learn about weather, and they're really accurate. And the irony is, you know, this is a offshore seamanship workshop. They are at their most accurate offshore. The further you are from land, the more accurate grid files are, because they're less impacted by land things that can change weather around locally. Grid files are no good really for predicting thunderstorms and squalls and whatever, but in terms of predicting deep ocean gales, they're really good about it. In the short term, which I think of in terms of windows now, up to 4 or 5 days, sailors are armed with incredibly reliable weather information. So your decision making is more data-based and it's more dynamic. You'll make a change on a routing decision change that you would not have made 20 years ago, simply because you have a real, even though everything in your body, and I used to tell people I can smell the wind coming. But nowadays you can look on your iPad and go, oh, the wind is coming. And so you're able to make decisions that are pretty reasonable, and this limits your interaction with storms. If you can look at a 4-day window, when we shove off from here going to Bermuda, we'll be just about to Bermuda from the mouth of the bay in 4 days. And then when we shove off to go down to the Caribbean, we'll be really close to being into the heart of the trade winds where the weather's more predictable in 4 or 5 days. So it's changed the game for sure. So while weather itself is worse, the ability to see what's coming is much better. The two kind of balance themselves out. My mom, in her trip around the world with those minimal gales, they never got a weather report. I'm pretty sure after they sailed beyond the VHF range of Key West, they never got another weather report because they could never figure out how to make their SSB work. But they did something far more important. They just sailed at the right time of year in the right ocean. And if you do that, you still minimize your chances of encountering heavy weather dramatically, although today it's not as reliable as it was then. But even so, the idea of, like we talked about in the Anatomy of a Passage webinar, knowing when to sail where is a huge factor in limiting your exposure to gales. What's cool today, though, is that sailors, voyagers are traveling much further afield than they used to. The idea of sailing to latitudes well beyond the trade winds, well beyond 40 north and south, has become really alluring. And as sailors extend their latitude range, there's more weather to cope with, for sure. So sailors are intentionally looking for some exciting cruising experiences. Basically, the higher the latitude, the higher the likelihood of encountering storms. So having storm strategies for making expedition-style sailing trips is super important. So when it comes to storm sailing, these are some key points to take away. Everything is predicated on apparent wind. True wind is useful in terms when you're racing in many ways for trim, but it's not very important in storms. What's blowing over your deck is what you deal with. And so your whole world is apparent when you're out at sea, and it's really never more apparent than it is in a storm. And point of sail, like we've talked about throughout this entire webinar, is really, really critical. Upwind in 30 knots can feel like a full gale. 30 knots on a deep reach can just be an exhilarating blast in the trade winds. So with that in mind, again, I hope this is one of the things everybody's taken away from these webinars, is that changing your heading is not against the rules. It is okay to change your heading and go on to a point of sale that makes your world better. You don't be a slave to a waypoint. Being a slave to a waypoint almost never gets you there any sooner than making your world flatter, faster, better sailing, keeping the crew happier. So a lot of cross-pollination in these webinars, but not being a slave to a waypoint should be one of the key takeaways. And don't worry, it only took me about 35 years to figure that out. We're gonna blow by that one for now. So preparing for heavy weather sailing. Actually gonna go back here and just, you guys can see this. We're not gonna do them because we've had some technical issues, but one of the things that we do have, we have a lot of really interesting heavy weather footage and videos on YouTube. They were taken by our dear friend Sergey, who's paying attention tonight, who's watching from Vancouver. And we'll give you access on how to find them. And I just don't want to go into the drill of going on and offline tonight because I'm not that confident of our connection. So anyway, we will talk about that afterwards. But we did one particular Atlantic crossing, and Sergey got some amazing footage. And it's just really interesting to look at what the Atlantic looks like when it's blowing 30, and to think, wow, force 10 is a lot worse than that. So preparing for heavy weather. This is something that I drone on and on about, and sometimes people just don't get it. People buy all sorts of equipment for storms, from drogues to sea anchors to heavy weather this, heavy weather that. But the most important heavy weather bit of kit on your boat are your sails. You have to have, if you're going to go off on an epic passage, you need good sails, because everything you're going to learn tonight and everything you already know about dealing with heavy weather goes out the window when the sails blow apart. I know this from delivering boats for so many years. The situation would develop, we'd be hove to, everything was fine, and the main would rip along a reef point, and all of a sudden all bets were off and we were forced to do something else. New sails, good sails, heavy duty sails are really important. Please, that's the place to spend your money. That latest electronic gizmo is nowhere near as important as a new mainsail, a new head sail, and some form of storm sail. And also you need to update your running rigging. We're going to assume that your standing rigging is fresh. We talked a lot about that when we were talking about preparing in the very first webinar, fitting out for blue water. So we're assuming that your standing rigging is ready for the task, but old lines are easy to say, they're fine, they're fine. But if they're already worn or chafed, they are disasters waiting to happen. When a chafed jib sheet blows apart and all of a sudden your sail is flogging wildly, it's amazing the damage that will do. A flogging sail can not only tear up a flogging sail, but that sheet can literally tear your mast down by ripping the shrouds out. It can get lodged under a hatch and pull that hatch right open. A simple, inadequate head sail sheet can be one of the most dangerous things on your boat. So, and we have such amazing lines in the world today. I mean, you know, Bob's a rigger by trade. The rope exercise that we go through at JKU is fascinating because we have fantastic lines available, and they are moderately expensive, but arguably one of the most important things to update before you go offshore. If a sheet blows out, that's kind of shame on you. And you should consider switching from big, hard, beautiful stainless steel shackles to soft Dyneema shackles in certain places. They're just as strong and they're much safer. When a shackle fails and the pin fails and the shackle is still run through a bit of running rigging that is now just flying around the boat, it can be deadly and dangerous. So there's a lot of ways to think about making your boat safer. And also it actually makes it more capable and efficient. So this is interesting to me, where you encounter storms. Because this also, I should have figured out a lot sooner in my life than I did. But basically, where storms really happen on a consistent basis, those kind of perfect storms, those really dangerous deep loads that rock your world, that force you to employ the strategies that we're talking about, well, yes, they occur in the Southern Ocean. And they occur there all the time, but that's not generally in the cruising plans of most of us. But what's a dangerous place to sail or voyages to make are translatitudinal passages at the change of seasons. Because the weather's unsettled and the weather is changing. It's worse in the fall than the spring typically, as the fine weather's shifting over into winter weather. But overall, that's the time when you really have tricky sailing. If you look at that grid file, this was an October passage, and we were classic passage for me, coming from Ireland down to Lagos in Portugal. And you can see Biscay is kind of in a pissy mood with 30 knots. And then right off the Iberian Peninsula, there's 35 knots whipping around Finisterre. One of the things about grid files is that they tend to read low in the upper ranges. A 35 knots southerly there off Cape Finisterre is probably going to feel like 40 to 45. 45 knots is force 10. 45 knots can be survival conditions if you're not prepared for it. This was October of 2018, and we were right about where that little plus is. Pounding, forereaching, bashing into these seas, trying to make progress to get south. This is what it looks like. This is what it feels like. This is the real world of many delivery captains and also many cruisers. So many of us on this side of the world take our boats from the Chesapeake, from New England to Bermuda and down to the Caribbean, and we encounter conditions like this. It's exactly the same on the other side of the Atlantic. It's exactly the same in the Pacific. The translatitudinal voyages, those are the ones that cause you the grief. Those are the ones you really want to pay attention to. When I look at so many of the storms that I've had over the years, they fit this equation. Frontal passages that interact with strong currents. That's another place where you really can have accelerated winds that exceed what the grid files will show you. On this side of the world, that's when you have a nor'easter at 30 knots moving quickly that collides with the Gulf Stream, which flows, which has a drift to the northeast, and the wind and seas conflict and they stand up the waves, and it can be unbelievably ugly, dangerous, deadly in a couple of instances that I know of. So also out of season tropical and also extra tropical storms can be really dangerous. Tropical storms move very slowly and are plotted with great accuracy and a lot of fanfare. So you have to be pretty oblivious to the world to not know that a tropical storm is making its approach. Once they go extra tropical, typically meaning that they lose the deep rotation of a deep low of a cyclone, and they speed up and they become essentially a rampaging frontal passage. They hit you fast and they leave you fast, to quote Captain Ron. But they are really dangerous and they are much less predictable. And you can have these tropical storms go extra tropical, typically in the Atlantic and in the Pacific in the fall, in both hemispheres, and they can rock your world. That's where storms come from. When you're making a trade wind passage, even if you have the Meramu conditions, you have super accelerated trade winds in the South Pacific, it doesn't feel like a gale because you are essentially reaching with them. 35, 38 knots astern with your staysail or your head sail deeply furled and pulled out and sailing at 8, 9, 10 knots feels like 28, 27, 29. It's exciting, it's beautiful, you're flying, but it doesn't feel like we felt punching into a 30 knot south wind off Cape Finisterre a few years ago. It's all about point of sail. And when you're sailing within a wind band, you typically, because you're typically trying to sail with those winds, those aren't where you feel like you're encountering storms. hopefully that makes sense to everybody. So one thing I've said over and over in these 4 webinars, you need to be able to make your sails small, and you need storm sails. Most boats are set up to sail across the wind in moderate winds. You buy a new boat today, it has a nice main with 2 reefs in it, a fractional head sail that you can furl. It's a little small to begin with, and as you furl it, it gets really, really small. And you are supposed to go downwind with an A sail, with an asymmetrical spinnaker or a conventional spinnaker. The reality is, for voyaging, you need 3 reefs in your main. You need the ability, if you can in any way set it up, to have a storm jib that is taken off the forestay and set up on a staysail stay or a Solent stay, something to bring the center of effort aft and down. And so you need a storm jib, even if it's just you don't have the ability to have a cutter or a staysail stay. If it loops over, if it has a sleeve like the ATN Gale sail, goes around your rolled up head sail, you need to be able to make your sail small. So this is interesting. Chris, was sailing with us on this, and Pam and Taylor, this was just last week. We were on our voyage to nowhere. We got back to the Chesapeake Bay, and we had 30 knots on the nose. We were punching our way up the bay. This is forereaching. We are triple reefed main and staysail. I'm just going to play that again because it surprises people, but oops. We are literally going up Chesapeake Bay a week ago, we were down to triple reef main and staysail. We were absolutely unbothered. We just punched our way right up the bay. No worries at all. And it was not a big sea, but just a choppy sea, kind of a Great Lake sea kind of sea. And with the way Quetzal's main is, with only the top 2 battens full, we were able to reef and unreef the main very easily. And we forereached, literally beat right up the bay. So the ability to have those really small sails just changed our world. So we're sailing very close to the wind there, and we're barely even heeled, and we're making good progress. That's the way you set your boats up. That's how, when you can sail like that, 30 knots on the nose suddenly is just kind of a bit of an aggravation. It's certainly not a serious situation. So we talked a lot in all the webinars, and I know it baffles people about reefing the main off the wind. And this is interesting because I was just talking with Matt Rutherford on Quetzal the other day, and you guys probably know him. He's a remarkable guy who sailed an Elben Vega around the Americas, probably you could make a case, it's the greatest yachting voyage of all time. And he's not anywhere near as well known as he should be. And he's done all sorts of big boats, small boat sailing. And I was saying, one of the things I was telling people is that I talk about reefing off the wind. And he says, who would ever go upwind on the ocean to reef? And I said, I don't know who would do that. But that's the way we all learn to reef. But when you go out to sea, you never, ever, ever come upwind to reef. So I just wanted to show you here in a series of videos what it looks like. Admittedly, these next 2 videos, it's anything but a gale. It's 15 knots. But this is how we reef on Quetzal, and it works beautifully, and we do it over and over. So here's Chris. He's easing the halyard. We're in the cockpit. We're under our fancy hard Dodger. And you can see the main is just dropping down. We are 100 degrees off the wind, and the cars are slippery. Pam has gone up with her tether, and she literally grabs the reef hook and pops it right there on the gooseneck. Now Chris is he's back in the cockpit. He cranks in on the reefing outhaul. We have not luffed or fluffed. That sail hasn't flogged one time. Not one time. We haven't come up into the wind one bit. In fact, we fell off a little bit more. And then once the reef is in, we've got really good gear. We've got Dyneema halyards, good line. Everything is led aft except the actual reefing tack line. And Chris now loads up the winch. And I told him to make it look easy for the video, but literally right like that, 15 knots of wind, bam, the reef is in. Never came up wind. The mainsail never flogged. And the truth is, the hardest reef to get in is the first reef. Once you go from the first to the second reef, it's less sail area you're dealing with. And going from the second to the third is the easiest reef of all. people sometimes say, well, why don't I go with a single line reef system where it's just one basic reef outhaul also acts as a tack? And I don't like it because it's so slow and it's so much friction. It makes this system harder. I also believe, and I think you all know, that moving about the boat is one of the safest things you do. And we can get a reef in the main, literally. That was real time. There was no faking there, no editing. It's about a 30-second operation. And so the idea of messing that up by having it turn into a 3-minute operation with your line making all these 90-degree bends, it really slows it down, makes no sense to me. I like to move. You can see Pam here. She's on the high side of the boat. She's tethered up. This is the way you sail. We're sailors. We're not mountain climbers, and we're not just living in some cabin in our cockpit. We move, we do things, and we sail fast and safely. The beauty of reefing the main is that you lower the center of effort without bringing it too far forward. With a inside the mast furling system, of which I like, I certainly am not one to condemn them at all because the reefing is so easy. You do have, by not lowering the sail as much as moving it forward, you tend to move the center of effort forward. Furling booms are just like slab reefing. They lower the center of effort. Just as a rule of thumb where the reefs are, someone asked me about this in the first webinar and I felt like an idiot for not remembering it because it's really simple. It's actually a mathematical equation, but it boils down to 20, 40, 60. The first reef reduction is 20% of the sail area and on all the way to 60% reduced. So with 60% reduced in your third reef, that's a really small sail. Who would have thought we'd have the third reef in Quetzal's Main in the Chesapeake Bay in June? Not me. But that's the way the world is today. That's the way the world's always been. But you need to be able to make your sails small. So we're going to talk about one more thing here, and then we'll take a break and do some questioning. Good. I'm working on a good schedule tonight. The staysail storm jib. I'm always talking about this, and I really do believe it's essential. It doesn't necessarily have to be a permanent fixed staysail, and a Solent stay can absolutely be perfect as well. But you need, I believe, a system that takes the furling head sail out of your storm management program. You know, it's really interesting because looking at the Cape Horn videos that we're going to see here a little bit later tonight, I realized that we had blown up our staysail on Gigi and we beat around the horn by furling our head sail in and out. And looking carefully at the videos, I'm like, holy smokes, we just have that head sail furled. Of course, we didn't really know what the hell we were doing either, but anyway, we were bailed out by an incredible little boat. So to me now with Quetzal, I just love when I can go to the staysail alone. That little video I showed you of punching along in the Chesapeake without any worries with 3 reefs and the staysail. We could have been sailing faster, absolutely. What were we sailing, Chris? Probably 6 knots, 5.5 knots, but it was an easy ride. I mean, we had a nice meal, we had a nice ride, worked our way into an anchorage. It was anything but stressful. With a head sail that we just rolled further and further in, we wouldn't have been able to sail anywhere near as close to the wind. The sheet leads would have been ugly because as you furl that head sail up, the leads, as you crank it in tight, they lay up against the shrouds, and it accentuates heeling. So when you can have a staysail or some kind of storm jib set up on a stay that's not the forestay, your life is better, absolutely. And the nice thing also about staysails and storm jibs that are sheeted aft of the that are not on the forestay is that when you heave to, which we're going to talk about a lot tonight, at that point your sheets are not laying up against the shrouds. Think about the way most of us sail. We have our head sail out, the sheets are almost always outside the shrouds. If you want to heave to, like we do in that quick man overboard situation, your sheets lay right up against the shrouds, no question about it. But that is not sustainable in a gale. You have to reroute them. And the beauty of a staysail is the sheets are always sheeted inside the shrouds to begin with. So they're just made for heaving to, which is a really important thing we're going to learn about tonight. So here's some examples of different ways to do it. My friend John and Cindy have their beautiful Valiant 42. They're sailing with us up to Maine next week. We're leaving out of here on Thursday. They have twin furling head sails, that good Schaefer gear. That's Quetzal stay sail. It's a tiny little sail that's basically a storm jib when I need it. And then as I showed you on the fitting out, the picture in the middle is you can actually put a slab reef in our staysail, which turns it into essentially a Force 10 storm jib. It's a super heavy sail. I mean, you can barely move the thing, but we're ready for strong winds. So before we go into storm tactics, which is kind of the heart and soul of what we're going to do tonight, let's just take a pause, Bob, if you're there, and we will take a few questions and try to stay ahead of it tonight a little bit.
Certainly. Can you hear me?
I hear you loud and clear.
Beautiful. Okay. Rolling all the way back to the beginning, can you recommend a good book on weather prediction, weather interpretation, using grid files and the like, using current techniques?
That's a really good question. Nathan, do you know of one? You know, that's because there's a really great resource in the world. His name is David Birch, and he's written all sorts of books on weather and navigation. And he's got a company called Starpath out in Seattle. And he's a really, really smart guy. But his weather books are thick, and they are. But I'm speaking a little out of date on that because I haven't looked at his most recent ones. But I think that the belief is that you need to learn about basic weather systems before you even think about taking the easy way on grid files. And the thing about learning weather is it's a whole new language. You have to learn the terms, and there's a lot of terminology involved. So I'm not sure about that, but I would like to find out. If anybody listening knows, please make a suggestion. And
Purpose, I would say the RYA actually has a lot of good material out there.
Oh.
The RYA has a lot of good weather books.
okay, so Nathan's saying the Royal Yachting Association has a good selection of weather resources. That's a really good question for us to answer, Bob, in our email. Thanks.
That'll be a good
Yeah.
follow-up answer. Yeah, definitely. A question right here in my backyard. Are grid files useful in Lake Michigan, or are they really limited to open ocean?
Well, I'll answer quickly about the Chesapeake, which I just went through, and then you can answer your experience there in the Great Lakes. They're
Sure.
nowhere near as useful in the Chesapeake as essentially just local forecasts are, because there's just a lot of different things that impact the weather. The beauty of grid files is offshore sailing, in my opinion. I mean, they're not even as accurate in the Caribbean, where they don't show the lees that big islands throw and things like that. They're getting better for sure, but their real advantage is offshore. How are they in the lakes?
I don't use them.
Okay.
I don't use them directly, I guess. My answer would be you can, but you don't need to. And some of the services that you can get, anywhere but out in the lake, middle of the lake, are grid file driven or driven by the same data,
Right.
but just rendered so much more friendly, like windy, like sail flow.
Right.
Things like that. I believe those are driven by the same data.
They
and
are. Same reason. There's basically 4 suppliers of all the data. Yeah.
And they seem very accurate to me, at least in Lake Michigan.
Okay.
But I've never actually attempted to use a standard grid file in Lake Michigan.
You have pretty good weather radar there as well. I mean, you guys can serious weather and things work pretty well for you.
We do. The lakes are covered very well. Depending where you are on the lakes, etc., you can get that data pretty readily. And then we're also well covered with the solutions delivered via satellite.
Okay. Awesome.
They actually work nicely too from Sirius and the like.
Yeah. That's cool.
So things are fairly dynamic up here, but they're well predicted, etc.
Oh, awesome. Okay.
Um,
Yeah.
Okay, moving down into sort of tactics and alike here. A discussion of the thought process of point of sale versus angle of approach to the sea,
Mm-hmm.
especially when the wind goes against the current.
So that's an awesome question. And this is the kind of thing that your mother used to do and say, hang in there because I'm just about to answer that.
Fair enough.
We're going to talk about forereaching, and that's a really vital part of it and a really good question that is very rarely talked about, but how your angle of approach into the sea state is critical. And I'm going to really talk a lot about that. And I have a cool video, 2 videos to show you about that. So,
okay, let's jump in here a little bit into sail design. You briefly mentioned your preference for 2+2 battens.
right.
Could you talk about that a little bit more, kind of where they are and why, et
Yeah.
cetera, et cetera?
So this is a strong belief I have in that when I prioritize my mainsail, number 1 for me is the ability to refit off the wind. Number 2 is the performance that it gives. So that probably strikes people as weird, but that's a Voyager's point of view. And I reef the main on a typical passage between a typical Atlantic crossing. I might reef the main 50 times. I might tack 4 times, and I might reef the main 50 times. That's what an ocean voyage looks like. So the ability to reef the main off the wind to me is really essential. And yet I don't want to sacrifice performance completely. So this was our great friend, Peter Grimm, suggested this main, and I've just become a real devotee of it. So the top 2 battens are full. And when you look at the way mains set, especially at the way mains luff and flutter, it's the top of the main that you lose. So keeping those 2 battens full allows you to maintain decent mainsail shape. I'm not going to pretend that a 2+2 main is as efficient as a full batten main. But what happens is when you ease the halyard, those full battens are pushing forward with so much oomph that they make it difficult unless you have a really slippery track for the sail to come down easily, requiring you to go upwind to reef the main. So the sailmaker, I flat out guarantee you, I'll bet you $1,000 tonight, the next time you talk, they're going to try to sell you a full batten main because they perform better.
He's not allowed to bet.
There's no betting, okay.
I'm rescinding that bet.
All right, we're betting $1. But the problem with that is that it becomes challenging to get them down off the wind. So for me, having those top 2 battens full, the bottom 2 just traditional short battens that still help with main shape really make a lot of sense to me. And thirdly, I like to have a loose-footed main. In other words, no track along the boom. It's another critical part of it so that the sail also drops down easily. The reefing off the wind thing is huge for me, and it is for lots of really seasoned voyagers. Because it's crazy. I mean, if you're sailing along, just in some of the videos we're going to look at tonight, and the idea that you're going to turn the boat into the wind to reef it, you just have to essentially prepare like for a full gale just to reef the main with the violence of the sea state. So my main shape, and Bob, you've talked a lot about it too, of having a strong track, which is a Teflon track that runs up the mast that makes your luff real slippery. And
Yep.
I think that's super important too. So in terms of sail construction and design for me, my mainsail is designed based on reefing off the wind offshore in big seas.
Okay,
Let's do
quick
one
question.
more and we'll carry on then. Yeah.
Yeah, this is a relatively quick question. When furling with in-mast furling, how far off the wind can you be when you're reefing?
That's a great question. Pretty far. You can't be on a deep reach because the sail will lay up against the shrouds pretty badly coming in.
Yeah.
But you can easily be on a beam reach, and you can probably be up to 100 to 120 degrees off the wind. And in fact, the sweet spot is probably close to a beam reach or just inside of that. so that the sail actually does roll better. You don't really want to come dead upwind within the mast furling, because the sail will flog and get all creased trying to go in the mast, and it's hard to know exactly where you stand. So the best strategy for in-mast furling is to be off the wind anyway. You can't quite, I would say deeper than 120 is pretty tricky. The thing is, you don't necessarily have to change your point of sail at that point. You just ease the preventer, keep control, and bring the boom in. Just bring the main sheet in to where it's in a position where it's closer to the center line. Give it a shot at that point, and there's a good chance you'll be able to do it from there without actually changing the point of sail that dramatically. If that makes any sense.
Yep,
All
that
right.
works. Thank you.
Okay, beautiful, guys. So now we're going to press on and talk about storm tactics, and how I prioritize them, what they look like, what they mean, and then we're going to give examples of it. Just to keep everybody online tonight, the plan is now to talk about tactics, and then we're going to talk about storm stories. So we're rolling along. Storm tactics prioritized. Number one for me, the first option, and I think should be for everybody, is to heave to. The second option, and it's a close battle. I mean, the forereach wins on the Electoral College. Forereach and runoff are about the same options. I've done them a lot of times, both of them, and each has a big advantage, and they have some negatives too. And the last choice is to lie a hull. Now that's different nowadays because there's gear you can use that makes lying a hull a whole different kettle of fish than just taking the sails down and floating. We're going to talk about all of them. So the first thing we're going to look at are storm tactics that are passive. That means that once you do them, basically you don't do anything else. There are lots of nuances on this. Like Larry Pardee was a great believer in heaving to and then setting a sea anchor. So there was a more involved process before he got passive, but he really believed in that system very, very deeply. I disagreed with him, but anyway, and I'll talk about how he did it. Lying a hull just simply means all sails down and drifting. So heaving to is a strategy where you basically tack without releasing the sheets and essentially put your boat into irons. It's funny because it's something that a lot of small boat sailors know how to do, dinghy sailors, because you heave to a lot waiting for a race to start. And older boats, particularly boats with longer keels, heave to dramatically better than modern boats with short keels. It's possible to make all boats heave to, but one of my gripes about modern boats, and they have many advantages, please, this is not just an old man's rant, but one of their problems is that they don't heave to effectively. If the keel is too short to provide enough friction, the boat just pivots on that keel, and it makes it difficult to stay hove to. Once you're hove to, you tend to lie about 45 degrees off the wind, and your boat sort of goes anywhere from, say, up to 30 and down to maybe 60 degrees as it rides the waves. But a magical thing happens when you're hove to, is that the waves on your windward side, in this diagram, the waves on the port side, they start to break. They break down, they break down and fall apart just before they get to the boat. The seesawing of the boat in the water, the pointing up, the falling off, the pointing up, the falling off, creates what is called, believe it or not, a slick, the slick. And that slick tends to flatten out the water, disturb the elliptical movement of the water, which is what waves are, and they break down. And it's amazing. You can heave to in a 15-foot sea, take those waves essentially just forward of the beam, watch them rear up as they approach the boat, and then just harmlessly go under the boat. Lately, I've been showing people on our trips, just for the fun of it, what mariners used to do, where they used to heave to and then drop oil in the water on the windward side to help create and spread that slick. We don't drop oil, we drop olive oil in the water just to see what that looks like. Next time you heave to, just try that. Take a cap full of olive oil, go just forward of your shrouds, drop it in, and watch the slick expand around your boat, and you can have a serious wave that has no chance of breaking aboard. But anyway, that slick is an important part of heaving to. And it just makes the world very nice aboard. It's almost as though you just turn the wind off. But there's strategies in how you do it. It's important that you reef before you heave to, so that you're not trying to reef your sail when it's backed. So you want to get your boat reefed down, both main and head sail, to the point of whatever sail plan you want to have up when you're hove to. And when you're there, you don't slow down too much before you heave to. One of the things that I've learned, that I teach and talk and moan about when you come sailing with me, is I want people to watch the waves. Watching your instruments is great, watching your sails is great, but basically the most important factor is how your boat interacts with the waves. So when you're about to make this tack, watch the waves. Don't tack right into a wave, because you're going to get stopped and you may not have a momentum to come all the way through. Tack on the top of a wave and tack through hard. Once you're through the wind, you don't release the head sail sheet. Hopefully at this point you're using a stay sail, because all the leads are clean. Typically, once you're through and the head sail backs, you turn the wheel back over to try to bring the boat out of irons, but you don't come out of irons and you stay stuck. The head sail is trying to pull you through the wind. The main sail and the rudder are trying to bring you back out against the wind, and you're essentially in irons. But it's different. Every helm is a little different, and it depends on the boat, the wind strength, and the sea state. So there's not just this one move where you tack and then throw the wheel hard the other way. You bring it back slowly, and you take a look at how it's working. It is critical that the staysail and storm jib leads are free. They cannot chafe against the shrouds. They will eat themselves to death in a couple of hours. The beauty of heaving to is you can heave to for days. You can heave to for 3 days through a storm, and absolutely have very little hassle to it. Heaving to is a beautiful thing. And for a trade wind trip around the world, if your boat heaves to well, you may never employ another storm strategy. For Quetzal, we can heave to pretty seriously and pretty successfully up to force 10. So when you heave to, you can see from this diagram, they're taking the wind on the starboard bow. We've tacked and the staysail is back. The main is trying to pull the boat back into the wind. Staysail is pulling it off and the boat is in iron. The slick is off the starboard side. What's really important is knowing where you're going. So the boat's going to make leeway opposing the wind or following the wind, but you're crabbing ahead at 1, 2, sometimes 3 knots if you can't slow the boat down more. So you're essentially making a course over ground that looks like something, one of those 3 arrows on the left. So you have to have sea room. So, and this is one of the beauties of having a plotter, is you can check and know what your actual course and speed over ground are when you're hove to. So if you are 50 miles upwind of a rocky island and you heave to and you're drifting right at it, and you're drifting at 2 knots, basically your course, your speed over ground, that's only a day. And suddenly you are in a really dangerous situation. So one of the things you need to do is think about heaving to on the other tack to maybe try to get some sea room. Or one of the reasons you must know and set your boat up to forereach is there's just a lot of times you can't heave to and you can't run off because there's no room to do it. And so forereaching, which we're going to talk about next, is a really, or after we talk about lying a hull, is a really important strategy, just because a lot of times it's the only strategy. But if you have sea room and you can heave to, it's absolutely magical. We've hove to in some pretty serious Gulf Stream gales in Quetzal, laid there. The longest we've ever hove to is for 40 hours, and it was really honking, and we were absolutely fine. We made good food. We had captain's hour. We were all on top of things, but it was pretty safe, and it was kind of cool. We had a front row seat on watching a gale unfurl. Lying a hull technically is just dropping all the sails, battening the hatches, locking the helm so the boat tries to point to windward, but then is countered by the force of the wind and waves. In many cases, it's the last resort. It's the only thing you can do. It's really all you can do if you've lost your rig. So or lost your rudder for sure. We're going to talk, one of the 2 storm stories we talk about tonight that I go into detail on, look at lying a hull and what a bad option it really is. And also when we were capsized in Gigi, while we weren't quite lying a hull, we had the triple reef main set, we were almost lying a hull because we were barely moving. Not much speed, but a little bit of speed is really your friend in heavy weather. Think of yourself standing at the beach, just taking the waves right into your chest, or maybe diving under and swimming through them a little bit. It's kind of a similar analogy to when you're just letting your boat lie there and get whacked. However, lying a hull with a sea anchor or drogue, a sea anchor off the bow or a drogue off the stern, that's a whole different kettle of fish and is becoming more popular. It's always been a really important way to deal with heavy weather on cats and tries. It's becoming a bigger thing on monohulls with the improvement of drogues. And like I told you, Larry Pardee was a believer in getting hove to and then setting a sea anchor to leeward. A sea anchor to windward to try to keep the boat completely balanced. So I'm not a big fan of these things. And the reason being is that I have tried a sea anchor once and it worked unbelievably well. We used it on a Hylas 49 on a stormy November delivery, and we didn't need it, but we wanted to try it. And they work like real anchors. I mean, they just arrest the boat, stop it right now. And the problem is you've got to adjust it so that you're in the right wave length. You can just have wave after wave break over you, or you can have the boat run down and try to run over the sea anchor as it comes charging down the wave. It isn't just like dropping it overboard and saying, okay, my worries are over. To me, a sea anchor is not a great sailboat storm strategy device. It is, however, something that might save your life or your boat should you lose the rudder or the rig and you're drifting down on a lee shore, and you have time to either make an emergency call or an emergency repair. For that reason alone, it's worth carrying a sea anchor. Drogues, on the other hand, have become more and more popular. Jeannie Socrates, who set the world's record for oldest person to single hand around the world, is a big believer in a Jordan Series drogue. She has a Naiad 38, speaks glowingly of it. We've had drogues over the years. We have a Gale Rider aboard now. We rarely, if ever, use it. I'm more of the Motessier and Skip Novak school of thought to keep the boat moving and keep sailing. It requires a little bit more involvement from you, but the boat seems happier. Even with a drogue and you run downwind with it, people will tell you you need to have really good washboards and your cockpit needs to be able to be pooped, because you will slow the boat down and the breaking waves will crash aboard. However, if you've lost your rudder, it's without any question the best way to control the boat. And many people believe that just sailing slowly with a drogue is the way to handle extreme conditions. I'm not one of them, but a lot of people who I respect tremendously are. It's something I should get a Jordan Series drogue and try. So those are the passive strategies. The active strategies are forereaching and running off. Forereaching baffles people almost as much as the idea of the mainsail preventer, of the main boom preventer. So forereaching is simply sailing into the wind at an angle that your boat takes, that keeps the boat relatively flat and relatively happy. So the thing of it is forereaching depends a lot on the sea state. One of the things that I am always telling people to notice when they're sailing offshore is it's really rare for the wind and the waves to line up exactly. I mean, rare to the point of almost never. There's always a preferred tack. There's always a little bit more of an open lead on the sea on one side or the other, and that's typically the side you want to forereach on. If you can take the wind at 45 or 50 degrees off, but the seas at 60 or 65 or 70 off, you can handle an unbelievable amount of wind that way. That's the classic fore-reaching angle. And unless you've been out in a kind of a deep ocean gale trying this, where the waves have a long 10, 12, 14-second period, and you notice very, very quickly that the wind and the waves don't line up. There's an old saying that the wind is the waves are the wind's messenger. The waves start changing before the wind direction does. They're being impacted from far away with a lot of energy. And so there's going to be a wind shift coming, you know that for sure, but looking at the wind, looking at the waves, you can go, whoa, wow, there's like a 15-degree difference here. And so that's the tack you want to fore-reach on. It's really hard to explain that to people because all they envision is this violent crashing. I'm going to show you some fore-reaching here and then show you some really rugged fore-reaching in the Southern Ocean where we punched Gigi through a 50-knot gale upwind, a 32-foot boat. And it's not easy, but sometimes it's just dramatic what happens. But what's critical with fore-reaching is that you can move away from a hazard, and probably even more important is you can move away from the storm. One of the things about Grib Files is if you can get a 3-day Grib file and scroll through it or watch it on Windy, you can see what the wind is doing, which is essentially representing what the storm is doing. You can tell which way the wind is moving and where it's going to be less. You can choose a tack that will fore-reach. You can fore-reach on a tack that will take you out of the storm quicker. Just think about it. If it's a slow-moving, serious storm, moving at 6 knots, if you can fore-reach in the opposite direction at 3 knots, you're effectively putting 9 knots, 9 miles between you and the storm every hour. A day of that might just change your world completely. Being hove to or lying a hull or even running off just delays your leaving the storm system. Fore-reaching, one of the big advantages, and every single ocean racer in the world, this is how they deal with heavy weather. Every Volvo boat, every serious boat, they punch through this stuff and they get away from the system as quickly as they can. You can make it you can fore-reach with just a staysail, just a storm jib. You can do it for sure with just a deeply reefed main. I prefer to try to have both of them if I can, but if I have to take one or the other, Quetzal can fore-reach in force 10 with her staysail, her storm staysail, and it's pretty impressive how it works. This was us fore-reaching after the frontal passage just this past fall. Tim and Gretchen may recognize these pictures, but this is just, we have the staysail up, double reef main, it's blowing about 30 knots. And seas have started to lay down, but we are just easing along. I'm literally standing on the bow taking these pictures. It's not tough going. And this is a classic example of what fore-reaching. Now we're sailing 50 degrees off the wind, but look at the angle we're taking the seas on. They're way off that. That's classic fore-reaching. So to answer your question, look at the water, look at the point of sail and choose the strategy that's going to give you the best ride. And so that's a thing that is often misunderstood about fore-reaching. So I hope that helps. Thing about fore-reaching is you've got to have really serious gear. You can see in that picture, our head sail is completely furled in. It's always a huge relief for me to get the head sail furled in. I know the pressure's off the forestay, the pressure's eased on the rig. I'm not worried about the furling gear, and that staysail of ours can take a tremendous amount of wind, and we can put the reef in if we have to. It's a good setup. So running off is a classic strategy that we've all used. We use it all the time whenever we encounter a squall. Typically in the Caribbean, you get these wicked thunderstorms that come through, and the way to deal with them is just, they call it, the strategy down there is called ride around the squall, where you just keep falling off, keeping the wind at about 120, 120, 120 until the squall finally peters out, and then you come back on course. Running off in a deep ocean gale is more challenging because it requires really good helming. that picture on the left was that crazy delivery where we took the Ocean 71 across the Atlantic in the middle of the winter. It's interesting. You can tell how long ago that was looking at the harness that I'm wearing. Oh my, that's true. Yeah, there's a lot more hair, but anyway, we didn't even have inflatable PFDs. You know, it's amazing. This is just the kind of thing an old person says, but we cross so many oceans without the safety gear that seems so essential today. And I don't know whether the statistics bear out that people are any safer. I know they spend a lot more money on it, but anyway, we had to hand steer that boat most of the way across the Atlantic because the autopilot was really struggling. But mind you, we were having days of 50 knots. We had force 10 for 5 days in a row. So the notion that the seas just became enormous and there was no way the autopilot could handle it. We could have hove to, but we were greedy for progress. We sailed from Newport to the Azores in 12 days, and it's like 2,200 miles. We were just scooting across the Atlantic. And so we were willing to bite the bullet and steer, but it was a lot of work, and you could do about an hour of it before you really started to lose your concentration. So running off is a strategy that we've all used either in short-term situations, but the long-term effects of running off are tricky. When you're down in the Southern Ocean sailing, you know, before the big westerlies, you've got to make sure that your self-steering gear is up for it. And now we have, you know, Quetzal is set up with a great autopilot and the hydrovane. We don't steer very often anymore, but still, if it was force 10 downwind, our systems would be taxed too. So the running off is more of a short-term solution than a long-term solution in my mind for most cruising crews. Talk quickly about multi-hulls, because I know Scott, who's tuned into all the webinars and is coming sailing with us this fall, really is interested in purchasing a catamaran. You know, there's kind of a schism between mono and multi-hull sailors. I've been lucky enough to sail cats a lot. Nathan and Vivian delivered a cat across the Atlantic. I've only had one big storm in a cat, and it was in an old Fantôme Pajot Venezia. It was on a delivery coming south from Martha's Vineyard, naturally in late November. And that change of season, translatitudinal passage, and we encountered a big blow south of Cape Hatteras, and we handled it just fine. We forereached with a deep reef in the main, no head sail, taking the seas essentially at 60 degrees off the wind. I remember we did put the low side engine on at one point to really kind of help us track better. There's a lot of noise and a lot of activity with the water charging between the hulls. If you were standing in the cockpit, you could have an exciting time when the water shot up through the cockpit scupper and about 20 feet into the air. But basically the boat handled it just fine. The seas were not crazy. They were confused, but I never felt like we were in any position of capsizing. That being said, I was fundamentally aware that I did not want to take those waves dead on the beam. With multi-hulls, you either have to take the seas upwind or downwind. There's no option to take them beam on. Cats, cruising cats and tries do not heave to very effectively. People say they can do it, but you don't do it as a storm strategy. With multi-hulls, you basically want to avoid those beam on breaking seas, and they are just made for running with a storm with a drogue or some slowing device, some braking device to keep the stern under control. They have tremendous buoyancy, which makes them ideal for running off in serious weather. The truth is multi-hulls are way more seaworthy than most monohull sailors want to admit. They just require a different set of tactics. And ultimately, if you do encounter a severe storm and they capsize, you stay capsized. However, they typically float, so you have a hell of a life raft. It's your boat upside down, but that's also a rare thing. And more people have done epic voyages in multi-hulls now, and so there's a better volume of information on how to handle them in storms. Even just last year in the South Pacific, we had a rocking ride, John and Cindy, if you remember, sailing from, was that, yeah, we went from Huahine back over to Raiatea. You know, we had like 25 or 30 knots. It was 40 miles, so it was a short ride, but we had the Katana 47 doing 12 or 13 knots. And we were just, it felt like we're on a magic carpet. It was a little scary once we got to the channel and had to negotiate through the Motu. But overall, it was, we didn't have an anxious moment with it. So there are strategies for cats, for sure, Scott. I hope that helps, and we'll talk a lot about it more. So I always kind of go back to these things because it's during storms when leadership really has a big and important role. Storms and gales, they're nothing like movies. The worst storm movie in the history of the world is The Perfect Storm. There was an interesting book, but the problem is the pacing of the way the storm occurred in that movie and in the book. It was clear that nobody had been to sea who was involved in that project, because it's not as though there's this epic moment and then you're relieved, and this big high and then more relief. The thing about storms, the reason they can be so dangerous is they beat you down. You get tired, you get cold, you get hungry, you lose your initiative, you get scared, you really start making bad decisions. Maintaining a positive attitude is probably as critical as any strategy that you employ. That sounds really corny. That sounds super football coachy, I know, but it's fundamentally true. If you're in a good boat and you have a good strategy, a storm, you'll get through it and it'll be the highlight of the story afterwards. But more importantly, you're really living in that moment, and it's cool. But you have to be aware of everything. You need to balance also the fact that you stay attuned with the fact that you need rest, the crew needs rest. And one thing about a deep ocean storm is that's when you will appreciate having a really good boat. So one of the things that's important in storms is gear. Taji is a great believer in gear. She always has good gear. The Swedes say there is no bad weather, just bad clothing. I'm kind of a low budget gear guy, to put it gently. I put a lot of stock in base layers, but I've come to the conclusion, boy, this will probably kill me from getting some fancy sponsorship.
It's more money for my budget.
It's more money for Tachi's budget. But you need to stay warm underneath your foul weather gear. I'm a believer that the outer layer should keep you dry, not try to breathe and be really fancy. So my strategy is to wear good base layers and just water repellent, essentially fishing gear, on the outside. It's funny, the editor at Sailing Magazine, I used to always submit stories, and she would say, John, please don't be wearing your fishing gear, because their advertisers were all these foul weather companies. But anyway, getting yourself kitted out for heavy weather is super important. And this is another place where having cockpit protection can make a huge difference. We basically have such a great setup now that we don't break out our foul weather gear until it gets really rough. I hope you're starting to see the symmetry of all these webinars. And my basic belief is that seamanship transcends all these divisions we've talked about. Seamanship is an integral part of storm sailing. It's certainly a key part of safety. You fit your boat out based on the experience you've had, the good seamanship skills you've learned. All this stuff ties together for sure. And you can see here, everybody's kitted out. This was the crew after a particularly rough Gulf Stream crossing. We'd left from Lunenburg, Nova Scotia, and just got rocked in the Gulf Stream. We had force 10. I love this picture because you can see the pod there. This is the old pedestal, the instrument. It's duct taped on. The flashlight and coffee cups are kind of askew. We had to rig up that radar. It had been knocked off of there. Kind of a classic gale experience. This is a sobering picture, though, every time I look at it. And I don't know if anybody's looking on tonight, Mike and Rolf and Pete and John and Christy, but we got across the Gulf Stream the day before it kind of blew up. We had 40 to 45 to 50. The next day, the nor'easter that we just skirted went to 55 and 60, and a single-hander and a 45-foot steel boat left Lunenburg 2 days behind us, an experienced chap who had circumnavigated in that boat, and he never turned up in Bermuda. He was lost in that gale. And it was really just kind of made the reality that this is serious stuff for sure. But 6 to 12 hours before a storm. Taji's made these cute little charts here for the webinar, but this is, you prepare good food. I am a believer in eating good food and not breaking out the sandwiches. Vivian's over there waving her hands. Vivian's a great chef. She believes this too. You make sure the crew is rested. I think one of the most surprising things when I find out we're headed for heavy weather, I often go straight to bed. I know that I'm going to be tested and I know I'm going to need sleep, and I sleep. I don't lay there in bed fretting about what's going to happen and what hasn't happened. I realize that the next 3 or 4 hours are really important for me to get sleep. You need to secure everything down below, because what happens in a storm is if you have to use your energy to dash below and resecure everything and get pitched around, it just starts a chain. It starts a cascade of things going bad. If you know there's heavy weather coming, everything needs to get put away, secured, hatches dead bolted, cabinets dead bolted. You really have to be on top of it. You need to check your lashings on deck. This is an important time to do a walkabout. Just make sure everything is set. Make sure the preventer's rigged, even if you don't need it, and ready to roll. Be prepared for, not having to go up there later. And then don't go into the bunker. Shorten sails up proactively for sure. Get ahead of the game. It's so much easier to go from the first reef to the second than from the no reefs to the second. Put the first reef in, even if you don't need it yet, because you're going to, and then going to the second reef is easy. So that suddenly you're in really good shape there. And then a good leader has a team meeting, even if it's you and your wife, you and your girlfriend, you and your boyfriend. You have a team meeting and you let everybody know what your strategy is, what you're thinking, and then you're also flexible, because a lot of times these things don't pan out the way they're supposed to. The information that we get today is generally so reliable that you just really believe it's going to happen, but sometimes it doesn't, and you can just lay there waiting for the storm and it never develops or whatever, and you get all frustrated in the process. So there's this kind of balance between where you don't go in the bunker, but you're ready to go. Everybody's clued into the program. You're kind of stoked about it. We've talked about it. We've trained for it. We fitted out for it. Let's see what this gale is going to be like. This is what I was saying. A forecast can be unsettling, waiting for a storm or a frontal passage. Stay active, keep sailing, and always, 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 always think about sea room. Land is your enemy. If you cannot make it ashore make it into a safe harbor before the worst of the storm is going to hit, don't try it. Do not try it. My latest book, Edge of Time, I talk about several different people who tried to beat a storm into the harbor and the boats were lost. Your friend is the ocean. The further you are away from land, the safer you are. It really is rare for a well-found boat with a good strategy to founder at sea, even in survival conditions. What does boats in are hard, rocky things, rocks, reefs, island shores. Sea room is your friend. Have sea room floating around your brain all the time. So we're getting close to these storm stories here. We're going to show you a couple of, these are old grainy videos, but really interesting, about our long ago trip on GG around Cape Horn. And they're fun to look at. Hopefully they'll come through the Zoom world pretty well. We'll take a break after this and we'll take some more questions. And then there are going to be 2 classic storm stories, and that will round out our last webinar. And then we'll take questions and have some chats. So the first video is a youthful mistake. This was when I was telling you about, I got the sail so small and slowed down to such an extent that a really bad thing happened. And then might have been easy to give up at that point when we were capsized and I was thrown overboard, but we didn't. We carried on and we made it all the way to the bottom of the world and rounded Cape Horn. And then you'll see, and I'll talk about it, an incredible upwind beat / forereach in the Southern Ocean. And then you'll see us run before a force 10 storm. It's they're short little things. They're not beautiful, but they're pretty interesting. So this is me tying in the third reef on Gigi. What does it look like, guys? It looks okay. Yeah. This is the night that we were capsized. You know, this was taken with a Super 8 camera. Yeah. This was a long time ago. This was 1983, and it doesn't sort of show how bad it was. But the wind speed indicator in this next diagram goes up to 55 knots and is just pegged there. And these were classic. This was a PBS station in Detroit did these graphics. It looks like a Pac-Man eating up the boat here, but we were rocked by this wave and capsized. I was pitched overboard, and luckily when the boat came up, I was actually able to get back aboard. The mainsail was shredded. We did a lot of damage, but it was an event that changed my life and changed my thoughts about storm strategies for the rest of my life. And realizing that right there at age 20, just turned 24, all these stories would never have happened if I had managed to climb back aboard. But we carried on, and this is our little boat Gigi approaching Cape Horn a few months later.
You had a long harness.
I had like a 10-foot harness on, yeah. I was able to free myself from the main sheet. Tether, yeah. So this is rounding Cape Horn. At the time, we were the smallest boat to ever double the Horn, meaning that we didn't go anchor and play around in the Patagonia channels, which we're hoping to do in a few years. We just blasted our way around the Horn. And, you know, I've written about that a lot. I'm sure many of you have read about it, but it was an interesting, extraordinarily humble experience. I didn't feel like I was some kind of master mariner. I just felt grateful that we were alive and that we had the opportunity to do that. I didn't feel like I'd conquered anything. And it was a good thing because right after that, we ran into a Southern Ocean storm. This was just days of this, just pounding and beating. Watch the way these waves rock the boat here. Just, and we literally clawed our way 100 miles off the coast of Chile doing that at about 3 knots. But I had learned my lesson. I wasn't slowing down for anything. There was nowhere to slow down to. If we'd have hove to there, we'd have blown back around Cape Horn. So we carried on and we punched our way 100 miles offshore because we knew this was coming. This was a force 10 storm with 30-foot seas. And we watch how long this sea breaks for. They were enormous Southern Ocean waves, and we were charging right before them with just a little tiny bit of our head sail out. Amazingly enough, the wind vane self-steering was doing most of the work, and it was an incredible experience. Those were arguably the second biggest seas I've ever seen. Is it still? Yeah, okay. The only larger ones were in that Great Atlantic Gale in the Ocean 71. But it was pretty interesting, and we had learned so much. That was my education. You know, I always joke that I went to Harvard of the South, Cape Horn, because by the time I was there, I was a lot smarter than when I'd started, that's for sure. So we're going to talk about some storm stories next, 2 in particular, Bob, but why don't we now, before it gets too late here,
Okay.
take a few questions.
Sure. I'll keep plugging down the list. We've got a lot of questions tonight and a lot of really good questions. So let's see. Some questions on the gale sail.
Yeah.
Any concerns with them damaging the foil, damaging the furler?
Yeah, that's a great
good
question.
thought there.
And, you know, both Bob and I, ATN, who's the inventor and manufacturer of the gale sail, is a dear friend of ours and an incredibly accomplished sailor. To be honest, I'm not the world's biggest fan of the gale sail, and it's not just the gale sail, but of those emergency storm jib sails, because of the fact they have the potential to damage the foils as they really, really load up. They're not, it's not like that's a common problem, but it does kind of run around my brain that that's a potential issue. And plus the way the halyard attaches, there's a lot of room, there's a lot of play in the halyard for it to also have a pretty dynamic effect. They are definitely a solution when you do not have the option to rig up some kind of storm staysail. If you're in a 30-foot boat or there's no room on your foredeck for that other option, then I get that, and you don't want to go through the rigmarole of setting up running backstays. You're going to make one passage down to the Caribbean and then hang there. I totally understand that, and carrying that kind of wraparound gale sail is a really good option. But as your long-term storm jib solution, I'm not that sold on it. So yeah, to me, that's a pretty legit question.
Okay. A couple boat questions, because it always gets back to boats, and a rig question kind of thrown in there as well. Your thoughts on an aft cockpit versus a center cockpit in terms of access to the boom, in terms of ultimate, comfort, safety, etc., in storm conditions. And then I'll throw it in here just in the interest of time. A few times you mentioned a Solent stay or a Solent rig. Could you explain that?
Okay. Well, the aft cockpit, center cockpit, I mean, we might as well start talking about religion and politics as well, because there are advantages and disadvantages to both. There's no question about it. So I think in terms of dealing with heavy weather, it would be disingenuous for me to say that aft cockpits are not a bit better. And the reason for that is that you're typically lower, your center of effort is lower. You're further from the waves if you're doing any kind of upwind sailing. And probably most importantly, you typically have better access to the boom for reefing and emergency situations, if the boom is above a bimini, for example. However, center cockpits are unbelievably capable boats. The Hylas 49s I've delivered, the Stevens 47 that Bob has. I mean, these boats are just remarkable. Chris is looking at a Bristol 43. These are all boats that have sailed around the world with center cockpit designs. Center cockpit designs are, I think, unquestionably a lot more comfortable overall. And it's less to me about the deck design than it is about the hull design. The way the boat interacts with the water is more important than actually what's happening in the deck. The thing about a center cockpit is that the cockpit is often smaller, and sometimes in more modern boats, they don't have bridge decks, meaning there's not a chunk of structural fiberglass directly in front of the companionway, which is really nice for going up and down, but a little dangerous to see break in. So you have to think about that, maybe leave the bottom washboard in more often in a center cockpit. Another thing is that depending on if you have to steer a lot, like the Hylas 49 is one of my all-time favorite boats, but it's hard to brace your legs for a long steering stint there, whereas in Quetzal, the wheel's a pain in the neck because it's so big, but once you're back there, it's really nice to steer. So there's lots of trade-offs. It's, if you found the hull shape that you loved and it's a boat you loved and it's a center cockpit, there's zero reason not to buy it. That's for sure. I think if I looked at all the boats I've sailed, the Hylas 49 / Stevens 47, Hylas 47 are among the single most capable boats I've ever sailed. So I would not hesitate to sail them any place. A Solent stay is different from a cutter stay in that it is very close to the forestay. It's usually tied into the stem head fitting or a fitting that extends off of that. And it's maybe a foot or 2 foot behind the forestay. And because it joins the mast so close to the forestay, running backstays are not required. The typical backstay arrangement can support the Solent stay. So there's a lot of advantages in that you don't need runners. Typically, the way they're set up is the forestay, the furthest outstay will have a Genoa, maybe a 130, 140, and it'll be a little bit lighter weight, and it'll be a reaching sail. The Solent stay or the inner stay will be a 100 or even a 90 flatter cut sail, designed more for upwind sailing and efficiently furled up to 70%, 60%, in effect, making it similar size to a stay sail. It's a really interesting compromise. I have a fair bit of experience because my friend Steve Masita had a Beneteau First 456, which is an awesome sailing boat that he set up with a Solent stay. And we made a lot of passages on that boat. We always used Steve's boat when Quetzal was over in Europe in the winter. And I love the and that's exactly how he had the sail set up. Ultimately, you can't get to a storm jib size as much. You furl up the staysail or the 100% so much that you still have it up high and too far forward. But it's rare you need to get to that point. Linda and Lisa and Andy, who have an outbound 46, I think they're watching tonight. They're right here in Solomons. They have a outbound 46, which has a Solent rig just from the factory. And they can talk in the chat probably about what they do with theirs in heavy weather. They made a bunch of passages to the Caribbean and all through the Caribbean. So it's a cool option, and it's a fresh way of looking at a problem, and it's a little maybe better performance oriented. I confess I really like going to that traditional staysail on Quetzal. All right.
Okay, thank you, John. A question around the staysail. The staysail as a storm sail, do you change to a storm staysail? Do you build the staysail so it's strong enough to be your storm sail? Would you ever use an ATN storm sail over a furled?
These are great questions. Yeah. So this is pretty good timing too, because one of the projects we're going to do this summer here at Spring Cove on Quetzal is to turn my much loved Hank-On staysail into a furling staysail, which allows you to have the ability to shorten the sail to a really deep reef. We're going to do what we always do. We're going to massively oversize the furler so that we can do it under full load, and it'll be overbuilt. We're going to use a furler that's designed for a much bigger stay than what the staysail is. That being said, I still have a little bit of cringing about it. It's part of the Todgification. No, it's really a good idea. And Bob who's a great rigger, and I respect his opinion mightily, is completely behind it. But the way our staysail set up, I showed you in the fitting out. If you download or take a look at the fitting out video, guys, our staysail is traditional Hank-On, but with a row of reef points. So the way you actually put that reef in, and it's a hell of a good question, is you crack off the wind. You crack off the wind to about 100 degrees, maybe 120, which I know sounds weird. But you want to flatten the boat out. You want someone good at the helm, or make sure your self-steering is happy. You go forward, you ease the halyard, you ease the sheet before you go forward, and the sail comes down pretty easily. Even on a 47-foot boat, the staysail is pretty small. And I let the staysail down until it's pretty droopy. At that point, I just change the tack over to the reef tack. I invert the sheet from one side to the other, having to change the sheet, which is the real complication. But then, I re-rig another sheet on it, and I tie the foot through 3 different reef points, hoist it up, and now we have a unbelievably stout, small storm staysail. It has to be blowing force 9 for me to do that. So up to force 8, the staysail itself is strong enough, small enough to act as a storm jib kind of in place. And to me, I sacrifice a little bit of performance by having that small and that stout of staysail. I recognize that. But again, my priority is voyaging and not, being able to deal with serious weather without worrying about it in the back of my mind. And so the decision is made for that. When we do the furling stay sail, we'll actually, I think, gain more performance because I'm going to make that stay sail slightly larger than the stay sail we have now. Long-winded answer. I hope that helps.
Yep, I think that's good.
Oh, I didn't answer Bob about running a gale sail around the stay sail. I've never thought about that. That's a really cool question. Really, really cool question. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I would say probably, I mean, to start with, you want to build the stay sail strong enough so that you don't have to worry about it not being strong enough. You want to overbuild the stay sail. I don't love the idea of the gale sail, I guess. I would like a really overbuilt stay sail, small, cut very high, and a furler is, in my estimation, is only a concern when you're furling. A furler completely deployed is pretty bulletproof.
Yeah.
So even if you're in conditions you need to get the thing down, you can get it down. It's no there's no concern if you were to lose the furling aspect of the furler. You just want to make sure that stay never goes anywhere.
Right. Yeah, exactly. All right. Well, we should probably, guys, carry on to these storm stories, and we'll be able to get through them close to on time, maybe. Sorry about cutting questions short there, Bob, but we'll get cracking here. And then, like always, I'm willing to stay tonight. We'll stay. We can do a bunch of questions afterwards, and so let's get on to these because they're pretty interesting for sure. So I'm going to talk about two stories. The first one is an encounter with Hurricane Mitch, which was one of the deadliest, strongest hurricanes to ever strike the Americas. And the second one was a nor'easter in the Gulf Stream, which was terrifying. Some of you have been to my talks before at boat shows and things and have heard these stories before. I've told them a lot of times. To me, they're very reinforcing good decisions and bad decisions. And one, I look like a genius, and in the other, I don't. So the track of Hurricane Mitch in 1998. We were sitting in Fort Lauderdale. If you can see this on your screen, we're going to become that red line where we sailed from Lauderdale through the Bahamas down to the Virgin Islands. This was a delivery that I made so many times in my life. I delivered new Hylases from Lauderdale down to their charter base in St. Thomas. Probably made that trip in various Hylases at least 30 times. Knew the way pretty well, maybe more than that. The black line was the route of a offshore sailing rally from Norfolk, but then they detoured into Beaufort, and they were sailing down to the Caribbean. That yellow line is a line I could not figure out how to erase. So it has no significance. You can see the track of Hurricane Mitch there. So I was delivering this boat, Gulfstar Hylas 46, an awesome boat. It didn't look like this at the time. It was barely fitted. It was just fitted out basically because it was heading into charter service. It had a furled head sail and a furling main, and that was it. It didn't have a Dodger. It did have a Bimini. There were no storm sails. There was very little extra equipment. It was going into charter, and the owners were going to charter it for 1 or 2 years and then go cruising in the Caribbean, which ultimately they did do. So we shove off going back from Fort Lauderdale when Hurricane Mitch is over in that extreme left-hand side. When you see where it goes from red, which is Cat 3, to purple, which is Cat 4, to pink, which is Cat 5, and then it comes ashore and just demolishes Honduras, goes up to Central America and is heading into the Gulf of Campeche. All the forecasts were for it to go straight north, regather steam, and hit Texas or Louisiana. At that moment, we had a really good weather window to shove off to make the delivery down to the Caribbean. So we pushed off, pretty excited. And things were pretty primitive in 1998. I had no communication devices, no trackers, no grid files, no anything, but a pretty good forecast. And it's November, and this was a really rare late season hurricane. I didn't really have a worry on my mind. I had an odd crew. I had the owner and his wife. The owner was this foot chap, Bob. His wife was Susan. We subsequently became really good friends. They were not prepared for Hurricane Mitch. The owner of Hylas in those days had told them that this was going to be a nice Caribbean cruise. He didn't tell them they were going to encounter the remnants of a hurricane. And Susan was particularly unhappy about that, as it all turned out. Anyway, we shove off, and the winds are light. We steam to the east. When you make that passage, you want to get easting in as quickly as possible, and we did. I was really excited. But you could tell the weather was changing. So Mitch did not go up to Texas or Louisiana. It made a hard right turn and actually demolished Key West with 50-knot winds. And because it came from a weird direction, that it came from the southwest, Key West is open to that. It was pretty destructive. It tracked over South Florida and started making its way back out into the Atlantic. Fortunately, we were south of it a bit and had gotten some decent easting in, but we still encountered enormous winds. We had steady winds over 60 knots. It was right at hurricane strength for us. Tropical storm hurricane strength, force 11, force 12 winds. But what happened was lows turned counterclockwise in the northern hemisphere. So we started getting a big southern swell as Mitch approached. And even though there wasn't a lot of fetch, the swell was impressive, and I knew that something was up. I carried this little cheesy shortwave radio mostly to get time ticks for my sextant. Believe it or not, we were using celestial navigation mostly in those days. And I was tuning in the National Weather Service, and the waves were getting really sloppy, even though the wind was light. And I was sitting on the side deck, and literally just as I got the weather service tuned in, and I hear the perfect Paul voice going, Hurricane Mitch has turned and is now approaching the Atlantic. Its position is, a wave comes aboard and douches the radio. It was like a scene from a bad movie, and it never worked again. But I didn't need that forecast to know things were going to get ugly here. You could just feel it. The sky, you could see it coming in the sky. The seas were building, and sure enough, the wind followed. So the winds built up from the south at about 20 knots, 25 knots. Then as the storm started to go around us and started to pass to the north of us, we had the winds go southeast. And at that point, it didn't make any sense for us to forereach off to the northeast, so we hove to. Without any storm sails, it was tricky. We had the head sail really, really reefed in. I rerouted the sheets so they were inside the shrouds. And the furling main is actually good for heaving to because you have a variety of sizes. So we furled it deeply. We hove to, and the Hylas 46 hove to pretty well. And the winds built to about 40 to 45 knots, and they kind of reached their peak of about 50 knots from the east. And it became pretty unpleasant to be hove to. Basically, the rudder talks to you when you're when being hove to isn't a good solution anymore. As the boat gets rocked around and the rudder goes up and down, you can literally see the pedestal shake and jam and move. And it just didn't feel right having the rudder loaded. So when you're hove to, you have the rudder loaded, right? The rudder and the main are trying to bring you back into the wind. The staysail or head sail's pulling you off. So that loaded rudder didn't feel good to me. Now the winds are blowing from the east, if you can envision that on this map, this chart, this hurricane tracking map. And we decided that we would come off on port tack and forereach to the southeast. So it was perfect. We started forereaching, beautiful. Even though the winds peaked at about 60, we were able to make progress. The seas were kind of coming around quickly, and we forereached to the southeast. And then as the winds kept backing and they went to the northeast, we were able to get back on track. the winds then, as we were forereaching directly away from the storm. It was a classic storm strategy. The storm moved further away from us. The wind opened up. Suddenly we ended up on a close reach. We let out a little more sail, and we ended up on a beam reach. And we made, ironically enough, despite having hove to for 12 hours, one of the fastest passages we'd ever made from Florida to St. Thomas. And the strategy of sailing along and keeping moving, not being in the bunker, but being aware as the winds headed us. And I didn't want to forereach to the northeast because I suspected that was the direction the storm was going. I mean, anybody could have sensed that. I hove to, let the storm kind of pass us to the point where we could forereach on the other tack. It really worked out super well. That's a classic case of good storm management. So feeling pretty good about myself on that one. There's a really sad addendum to this story. So this is a boat called Kemseka. It's a terrific boat. It's a Tayana Vancouver 42. The owners of the boat had made, I think, several passages between the Caribbean and the East Coast. Capable boat, capable crew. They, if you go back here, are the black line. Well, they had a more dramatic interaction with Mitch than we did. Their wind strengths weren't much different than ours, but they were taking on bigger seas. They ran into really violent conditions. And at one point we were about 50 miles apart, and they were lying a hull. They had reached a point where they felt like they couldn't handle it. They had some terrible seasickness aboard. They took all sails down. They describe a terrible, terrible night of the boat just being rocked around violently. And they made it through the night. And the next morning, when the winds had actually diminished to some degree, but the sea state was completely rocky and confused, and these tumbling, breaking waves were falling from every direction. Eventually, one of those waves overwhelmed the boat and they capsized. And the boat righted itself, but it was dramatic. The boat was damaged severely. One of the couples was the broken back, really dangerous injuries. They put out a mayday and they were rescued and the boat was abandoned. And it was as sobering to us because we were really close to where that happened. And we just had a fully different experience in the storm. Granted, their experience, they were in a worse spot than we were for sure, but not dramatically worse. And I always use this as an example that having a strategy of using your sails, keeping moving, trying to stay ahead, stay involved and making dynamic decisions is almost always better than lying a hull. They probably would have been in a better situation with a sea anchor or a drogue or something to help stabilize the boat. But the strategy they chose was unfortunately really a bad one as it all turned out. So the next storm story I'm going to tell you about, and then we'll get back to all the questions, is aboard Quetzal. This was Quetzal back in her glory days when she had her teak decks. This is a beautiful picture. We're charging into Bequia. I'm being really lazy in this picture. I don't even have the staysail set. We've got 2 reefs in the main and the head sail furled in. This was just an accelerated trade wind as you approach an island. And the winds, there's kind of a low pressure that develops at the tip of each island, and the trade winds wrap around, and we were charging into Bequia at 10 knots. But the storm I'm going to tell you about is a delivery that we made from Nova Scotia to Florida. Ultimately, or originally, we were going to go from Nova Scotia to Bermuda, and then from Bermuda to Florida. But we had unbelievably bad weather. So this was November, and we were doing our heavy weather passage, as we do every year. And we were trying to sail from Lunenburg down to Bermuda, and then from Bermuda over to Fort Lauderdale. But there were gales in the Gulf Stream. Hurricane Tomas had gone extra tropical and was marauding across this section of the Atlantic. We were waiting in Nova Scotia, and we waited 1 day, waited 2 days. You know, I always run these trips on a pretty tight schedule, and the crew was anxious to get going. So we made a sail in strong winds one day down to the tip of Nova Scotia to Shelburne. waited there as a force 9 storm blew right through the marina we were tied up in. And the next day we shoved off and immediately had to change our plans because of the wind. And we decided to sail across the Gulf of Maine over to Cape Cod, where we hoped to ride out what was going to be an intense nor'easter. We didn't quite make it. We hove to in the Gulf of Maine for 8 hours and made it to Cape Cod the next day. I had a really interesting crew for this trip. I had Giorgio and Jan, who are now, I just got an email from them or a text from Jan yesterday. They are halfway between Hawaii and Sitka, Alaska, aboard their Hallberg Rassy 48. Giorgio was an experienced sailor, a really good sailor, a heart surgeon, and he was pretty critical to what became the success of our storm strategy here. I had Rick and Deanne, who are great friends of mine, who have been cruising in the Caribbean they cruised for 7 or 8 years aboard their Caliber 47. They're just now winding it up and putting the boat on the market. Kevin, who has a Passport 40 down in Fort Lauderdale. So a really good crew, but everybody was stressed and tired and taxed. We finally get to Cape Cod and we weather another big storm in Providence in P-Town. And it finally all blows through, the sky's clear and a high pressure comes in and the winds are 25 to 35 knots from the north and we take off. We realize that we are not going to be able to hit Bermuda at all. We run well out of time, but we think we can lay Fort Lauderdale or at worst Cape Canaveral. Everybody's excited. We shove off and we go. Well, the winds quickly begin to clock as they do in a high, and they go from north to northeast and they build. The weather's crazy beautiful. It's clear and bright and cold, and the winds are 35 to 40 knots, and they're blowing now from the northeast. And if you can picture where that red dot is, that's where the Gulf Stream is. And the Gulf Stream sweeps in an arc. We've seen it on all these different slides we've shown over the webinar series, going from the southwest to the northeast. So the winds are from the northeast. The conditions in the Gulf Stream are going to be ugly. So the great Captain John is aiming right for that red spot because that's where the Gulf Stream is at its narrowest. Now, I'm not that stupid. I knew that it would be strong where it was narrow, but I didn't expect it to be as strong as it was. I wanted to make our crossing of the Gulf Stream as quick as possible. At that place, at that spot, the Gulf Stream was less than 60 miles wide. Typically, it's around 90 to 100. So we're charging toward that, and we are shortening sail. We've been on a deep, deep reach. We've dropped the main completely. We've dropped the staysail, and we just have the Genoa on the whisker pole. We're doing 10 knots, 11 knots, 12 knots down waves. We're flying. We're shortening up the head sail, shortening it up. We're down to just literally probably a third of the furled head sail, still on the whisker pole, steaming along. It's early morning. I'm in my pilot berth bunk. Rick and Deanne are on watch, and I'm about to relieve them in about 15 minutes. I'm awake finally, and I can feel the motion of the boat has really changed. And we've made the 220-mile passage down to the edge of the Gulf Stream literally in 24 hours without current. We have just been screaming along. But I know we're close now because just like that, the motion has really changed and we're rocking around and it's busy and bumpy. And I think, okay, I better get out there. So I climb out of my bunk, I'm slipping into my foul weather gear, and just in that 2 minutes, the ride gets really violent. I think, holy smokes, we're definitely in the stream. I literally am getting thrown around. I'm hurrying to get out. I get to the companionway. I throw open the hatch. I step up the steps just about into the cockpit, and I look up, and I can see that Rick is at the helm. He's steering because obviously the autopilot had been struggling. Deanne is sitting with her back on the companionway, up on the bulkhead by the companionway. They're all tethered up. They're looking forward to getting off watch in a few minutes. And I look up and I see from my view this incredible wave. And I've seen a lot of waves, and I'm not a wave exaggerator. In fact, I tend to tone them down because it's easy to say the waves were 20 feet. This wave was 20 feet and maybe 25, but what made it incredibly terrifying is that it was about to break directly on top of us. And I literally stepped into the cockpit and I screamed, hold on. And I slammed the companionway shut, slammed the door shut, just as the wave literally in a steep curl crashed right onto Quetzal's cockpit. It literally took the boat, it lifted it up, and it felt like it was throwing us toward the bottom of the ocean. The wave swept over the cockpit. It took the Bimini, the Dodger, it just eviscerated them. They no longer were in existence. They washed right out of the boat. It felt like we were angled over 70 degrees, sailing straight down. And I remember thinking, and it's so weird, and it's such a clear memory, thinking so clearly that, so this is how it finally happens. You know, I've dodged this bullet many times in my life, but this one has us. I just cannot imagine anything but us getting to the bottom of that wave and either carrying on straight south, or more likely pitch poling, or best case scenario, turning hard one way or the other, broaching and rolling. And I'm having very lucid, very clear, very slow thoughts, thinking, you know, I'm going to miss Taji and the girls, the boys. It's going to be sad, but, you know, I've been this is what's going to happen. And I know that these thoughts are just percolating, that Rick and Deanne and I are toast. We're going to be swept away, but that I'm hoping somehow the boat rights itself and the crew below is going to survive. I'm thinking this so clearly, and it's happening in a second or two. And there's actually a lot of psychological data, what this is called. It's called slow motion perception. When events that are really intense happens, you remember them so clearly because they're occupying a big chunk of your brain at the time, and certainly later too. Anyway, as these thoughts are flowing down through my brain, we literally hit the bottom of the wave, and somehow Quetzal was not ready to call it a day. She hit the bottom of the wave, she flattens out, and she literally just kind of straightens out, and you can hear the water hissing. It's going shh, 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 and the wave just kind of rushes past us. And we were literally, I mean, Rick, Deanne, and I were essentially underwater, and the wave rushes the length of the boat, and we watch it just roll off the boat, and the boat is flat and just kind of shakes itself and wallows in the trough of this giant wave. And Rick is sitting there, he's at the helm, he's had the Bimini fall down, completely crush him under the Bimini. He's behind the wheel, he's underwater practically, his harness has inflated, and he kind of pokes his head above the water and gives me the thumbs up sign. Deanne is still sitting in that exact spot. The water's washed over her, so her harness has inflated, and she's sitting right there, and I have no idea what force held her there. And we're wallowing in this trough, just kind of stunned that we're still upright. And at that moment, we've kind of turned sideways and not even realized it, and a wave about half the size comes, and it washes right over the side of the boat. It hits the beam and just washes the boat, and that wave carries Deanne right off the boat. It carries her right to the stern, and her knees catch on the stern rail. One knee is on the stern pulpit, one knee is where the lifeline and stern pulpit meet, and I'm watching her go, and I'm just utterly horrified at this moment. And Rick is watching his wife go, and he's trying to free himself and can't even get free of all the debris. I leap back to the stern rail and I grab her by the thighs. So she's all the way off the boat except at her knees, and her harness is inflated, and she's going under the waves and above the waves and under the waves, and I'm desperately trying to lift her back in. She has a death grip on the lifelines herself and will not release, and I don't blame her, but I'm screaming at her. And she later told me I was just yelling at her. I'm going, Deanne, get your ass back on this boat. You're not leaving this boat. And I'm pulling, but I have no leverage to get her aboard. And I'm looking at that little stupid fitting we all have on our lifelines where they join the pulpits, thinking, if that fitting goes, she's going to go. And I'm thinking to myself, there's no way I'm letting her wash off this boat on her own. And again, I'm thinking clearly. And finally, Rick is able to get himself free. Giorgio and Kevin managed to get themselves out of the companionway because the Dodger had crushed down on it and they couldn't open it. They finally get out into the cockpit, and together we're able to lift Deanne back aboard. And we get aboard the boat. We get her aboard the boat, get her below, and we survey the damage, and it's pretty staggering. But the reality is we're completely still operational. We're completely still sailing, and we are blasting along. And we realized what had happened is with no autopilot on, no anything, the pulled out jib had literally been pulling us along downwind as we were fighting to get Deanne back aboard. So at this point, we cut away the solar panels. I know, babe.
Stop sharing so they can see.
Yeah, I guess I could stop sharing. Okay. Yep. Good idea. So anyway, we cut away the solar panels and the arches and all that, and we hand steered. Giorgio and I took turns hand steering in these monstrous breaking waves until we managed to get across the Gulf Stream. So this time the great captain totally screwed up, because by aiming for that small section of the Gulf Stream, that narrow section, I chose where the current was the most accelerated and where the impact with the northeast wind was the worst. And as a result, I led us right into a minefield. And that was not a good move, but we survived it. Once again, this time in spite of me, we survived it because of a great boat and some luck, and a crew that kept their mojo together. I mean, Deanne literally was fine. I mean, she was unbelievably resolute after that. She and Rick, you know, that didn't prevent them from going cruising at all. And Giorgio and Jan are literally sailing around the world today. It's pretty interesting. That experience didn't terrify them, but actually, I think they all think, wow, if we survive that, we can survive anything. But anyway, that's storm stories there. The final take on that is that we had to employ really good helming skills to sail Quetzal downwind through that minefield of breaking waves in the Gulf Stream. I've never seen the Gulf Stream like that. And sometimes it feels like I've spent my life in the Gulf Stream. And coming out the other side was an incredible relief. So we'll stop there, guys. It's lots of information. You know, it's one of the cool things about joining us for a sail on Quetzal is we have days to talk about these things. People say, what do you do all day out there? Well, we do a lot of talking, that's for sure, but we do a lot of sailing. Anyway, Bob, let's go back to you, brother, and we'll get back to questions because I'm sure there's a lot. This is a subject that I know that always intrigues everybody. But anyway, back to you, Bob.
Sounds good. We're going to do a lot of talking here. We have a lot of questions. A question I am unfamiliar with. You use grid files, but what about synoptic charts? I am
Synoptic
not
charts.
familiar
Oh,
with
absolutely. No, for sure. No, we definitely, you know, pre-grip files, everybody used synoptic charts, and they're unbelievably valuable today. The Ocean Prediction Center charts that you can get online are better than they've ever been because they incorporate wind information in a more accurate function. It just requires interpretation. So basically, to see the pressure gradients, it really lets you know a lot of nuance about what the weather is doing. And also with synoptic charts, you can see a bigger picture more accurately. It's interesting though. I mean, every time I download them and take them with me before a passage, I'm happy that I have, but it's easy to really get lazy and just use grid files, because grid files are kind of like the common man's translation of weather charts, basically. But the Ocean Prediction Center is an awesome website now, better than it's ever been. And in fact, they have a new synoptic chart that looks at grid files and gives a kind of an accuracy assessment of what they think the grid file accuracy will be. So there's so much data in the world today. And a lot of it depends on the system you have on your boat. You can get this stuff on your boat as well. It doesn't all have to be done beforehand. All right.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. Back to a boat question. I've got a Hans Christian 33 with a full keel and a very aggressive cutaway forefoot. I've tried to heave to, and I end up forereaching. Any
Yeah.
suggestions, ideas? What am I doing wrong?
Okay, I can totally picture what you're talking about. You're probably heaving to with too much sail up. So and it's really easy to be, if suddenly when you heave to, you're still doing like 3.5 knots and it just feels like you're forereaching with a back staysail, then you have too much main up. So you have to balance your sails a lot. The thing about all types of sail reduction, whether you're sailing or heaving to or forereaching, you need to shorten proportionally. So if you're going to heave to with just your staysail, then you have to have probably at least 2 and maybe even the 3rd reef in the main. The sails have to talk to each other and they have to be balanced, because otherwise the main and the rudder will just overpower the staysail. Or if you try to heave to with just the staysail, it'll overpower the rudder. So it's a balancing act. That's one of those things where sometimes you're surprised like how much you have to actually reduce the main to stay hove to. Another thing is, it's really hard to heave to in less than 20 knots. So you might find that you need winds of 25 to 30 to heave to. You know, there's a strategy where you're approaching an island and you want to heave to and wait till morning to make your approach. In reality, it doesn't work that well. It's sometimes a lot easier just to slow way down, ease along, tack back the other direction, and make your approach like that. Heaving to without consistent and relatively strong wind pressure is hard. So, and making sure that the sails are essentially equal really, really helps. And also mess around with the rudder position. It isn't just you tack, don't release, and turn the rudder hard over the other way. Mess with it. Sometimes you might just need to leave it in the middle. There's a point where there's a sweet spot, but heaving to is like everything else. It takes time, but I'm suspecting it's sail size and not enough wind.
Beautiful. Thank you, John. Question here, looking for your opinion on running the mainsail halyard back to the cockpit versus leaving it at the mast.
In terms of just in general,
in general, in terms of reefing, etc.
Oh, I see. I'm sorry. I spaced out. So the halyard, right. So the halyard, I think, being led aft makes sense from the standpoint that most masts today don't have winches on them still. Sort of the style, even older boats, a lot of boats are set up now with their kind of working winches on the cockpit coaming alongside the companionway. The halyard, you definitely get more purchase right at the mast. Anytime, I mean, you've taught me this, Bob, anytime you induce a 90 into a line's path, you're adding a lot of friction and a lot of load. There's no question about that. But I've found the halyard, especially again with the lines of the world today, my main halyard is this sweet little 7/16 Dyneema that's super slippery and super strong. So leading it aft, I'm a believer in, because also it's a lot of load to raise the main, even if you have a winch at the mast. And so you're up there kind of prone, cranking and cranking and cranking. The reason I don't like to have the reefing lines kind of come all the way back to the cockpit as well in a single line reefing pattern is it's just too slow and too much friction. So to me, it's a balance between having as little luffing as possible, but also making it, sort of reasonable for raising and lowering. So I believe in bringing the halyard aft, and the outhauls come aft, but I still manually deal with the reef forward. And that's kind of probably one of those things I'll end up changing in my life. But I think instead of a single line system, you're probably better off just to have an additional tack line that pulls straight down to another block at the base of the mast and back. All right.
Okay, thank you. Would offer the opinion one time you would not want to lead things aft is if you're trying to reef single-handed, that
Yeah.
could be tough unless you lead everything aft,
Yeah.
and
very
then that
good point.
becomes a lot of spaghetti in the cockpit and a lot of friction, et cetera, et cetera. Which is a segue into another question. Storm sailing solo. Sort of techniques, ideas have you got there when you're all alone?
Yeah, no, it's a really interesting question. I think strategy-wise, it's very, very similar. I do think with any kind of single-handed sailing, that you have to be more proactive. It's if you're reacting to every situation, you're just going to get really tired and worn down. I think the key for offshore passaging by yourself is to really be on top of things in advance, and not wait until the situation develops to respond. I also think that you need to really concentrate on sleep. My brother-in-law, Trevor, who's watching tonight, I'm not sure if he still is, but he's single-handed around the world, and he would get sleep in long segments of time. If you're sleeping in little chunks and you're never really getting a deep, restful sleep, you're going to feel that dramatically during a prolonged gale. And it's going to come back to really cause you a lot of trouble. So if you're single-handing and you just can't, you've got to force yourself to really get your body grooving along to where you feel strong. Because the thing about storms is they're tiring, and single-handing is tiring to begin with. And if you're a tired single-hander when a gale comes up, that's a recipe for trouble. So I think it's less strategy and more basics. I think single-handers have to be really clued into their body. And in terms of strategy, also, so you might want to just heave to earlier and literally get some rest. Heaving to is a great time to sleep. You cannot have eyes in the cockpit all the time. You just can't. We have fantastic technology today with AIS and radar. It's not foolproof for sure, but it's definitely better than you becoming exhausted.
Beautiful, thank you. A question, contrasting GRIB files versus the weather information from InReach text messages. What do you
It's a good question.
lose with text messages, I guess?
Yeah, you lose being able to really get a sense of what the weather is doing from kind of similar to the earlier question. The GRIB files are kind of decoded synoptic weather charts. And by being able to, and it's interesting, so when you're sailing in the Atlantic, for example, on this side, it really pays attention to look to the west of where you are, even if you're headed east, because that's where the weather is coming from. And so you can, open up a GRIB file that really leans west, and you'll get a much more accurate picture of what's coming your way. So the problem with the InReach system and any of those text systems is they're kind of specific to where you are at that moment. And that's kind of less of what you're worried about, because you sort of know what that weather is because you're living it every second. You're more interested in knowing what's coming and what the weather is going to be like where you're going. It's absolutely way better than not having anything at all. So lately, we have kind of a really unfair advantage in the world. And my brother-in-law, Trevor, who I just mentioned, has a weather routing service. It's a little small business. He loves weather, and he's kind of jealous that we get to do all this sailing, and he's got to run a marina here. And he and I text a lot. He just helped Nathan and Vivian on 2 voyages. They sailed Tiana 48 up from St. Thomas to North Carolina, and they just sailed their boat up from Florida here. And Trevor, they texted back and forth with Trevor. You guys have an InReach, right? yeah, to get kind of Trevor's take on the big picture, which is another solution to that. And it's so you also get just a different, real experienced view of things that way. I love downloading the grid files on board and having a big look at it. And then I love chatting with Trevor about it. And he and I kind of think, oh, that's a pretty good idea to go this way or that way. So, well, yeah, it's
On the
better.
Savannah, at least, we also had the Iridium, so we were looking at the grids as well.
Yeah. So it's, yeah, exactly. It's so seeing the grids is really reassuring, but anyway, I think that if you don't want to invest in that big a system, the InReach system is absolutely a huge help.
Beautiful. We have a collection of sale questions here. My main is not loose footed. Can I just not put the rope through the track, or does that not work?
It probably is not going to work in that loose-footed mains are designed to kind of have the draft be more shiftable. What do you think about that, Bob? My feeling is that the sail will just kind of bunch up, but it's something that might be worth trying.
It's gonna fly kind of funny. A loose-footed main has a straight line to go along the boom, and then tends to have shape directly above that.
Right.
So you're gonna have like a weird cup on the foot, I think.
Mm-hmm. That's what it's going to curve right there.
Yeah, it'll fly kind of funny.
The thing is, if you do have a a footed main though, you can still reef off the wind. You may just end up having to ease your outhaul as you do it. So, and it's not a problem because as you tighten up, as the first, second, third reef come in, the outhaul goes out of the equation anyway. So if depending on what the access to your outhaul is, you can still, I've reefed a lot of boats with footed mains off the wind by just easing the outhaul a bit, which helps the main drop.
Okay. Sail questions here. In-mast furling main questions. Do the sails furl easier on one tack versus the other? Depending which way the sail rolls up and
Good
the
question.
configuration looks like. What's your experience been there?
It's funny now. I hadn't really thought about that but I do think that it's true. That if they're loading, if they're loading kind of more naturally the way that the drum is rolling them up, as opposed to laying across it, if they're kind of going in behind it, they do roll in a little bit better. It's such a good question. I had never really considered it. I don't think that it's a major thing unless you feel it is on your boat, and then tacking in order to furl might be an option. I think of a lot of Hylas 46s that I've sailed with furling mains, and all these, we've done hundreds of boat tests with them over the years. It's interesting. I'm not sure the answer. My hunch is that it might, but it doesn't seem like it's a big deal.
Gotcha. Okay. And again, an in-mast furling question. I'm sorry, I'm asking the wrong question here. Any special considerations if you're going to sea with only a furling head sail? What would you suggest there?
Yeah, so that's kind of the idea of that's the gale sail as an option for a storm sail, and then also it's probably a good idea. I think it's a good idea for any boat headed offshore to have a spare head sail. Nathan and Vivian and I were just talking about that this afternoon about Ultima. they have some older sails aboard that they were looking at, and we're thinking that one of them might just be a really good spare Genoa, even though their sails are new. The idea of it's just not that uncommon to have a sail problem. I mean, even a new sail, if it rips badly along the luff tape, it suddenly can be really hard to use, and you might have to put another sail up. So I think, to me, if I was going offshore with just a furled head sail, I would carry a storm sail of some kind that I could rig up either loose luffed or around the furl sail. And even if it was just a secondhand sail, a spare, typically smaller sail that could be stowed away that would go up the same foil and have the same luff tape as the Genoa, as your main Genoa. I think it's pretty risky to go offshore with one roller furled head sail.
Okay. And back to the question I was gonna to here that I screwed up. If you're going to sea with a furling main, are there design considerations for that main? Would you go to sea with the sail that came with your boat, or would you be looking for a sail, built a little differently, et cetera, et cetera?
So, as the kind of cop-out answer is, you would want to maybe talk to your sailmaker about that, but my opinion is you would probably want to beef that sail up. So, the thing about offshore sailing is that you never regret having heavier sails. Maybe in some situations, they're not as performance driven as light air sails, but that's really not kind of our major concern. But if it's a lightweight, sort of medium to low quality sail, and by that I mean the ends are not really well supported or not very beefy, and it's not heavily stitched cloth, then you're probably going to be worried about using it in severe weather. Having a sail that is heavier, for example, our sail is slab reefed, but it's just over 10 ounces, the main. Roller furled sails can also be heavier construction for sure. There's no doubt about it, and they should be. But that's something you have to really kind of talk about with your sailmaker, because you still want to make sure that it furls more than adequately, that it furls well. And the thing is, making your sail heavier doesn't really make it marginally thicker. So it's still going to slide in the slot and be furled without much problem. It's just going to be a lot better sail. Also about a furling main is that they have a lot of wear and tear along the edge of the track from the mast itself. So they need to be pretty beefy, because they do tend to, as they go in and out, they interact with the mast itself a lot. And if you're on one point of sail for a long time, it can lay up against there for a long time and chafe. So I think roller furling mains need to be pretty beefy in general.
Okay, thank you. A Jordan Drogue question. If you choose to use a drogue, what's the best way to attach the drogue to the boat? Just to your cleats, to some dedicated attachment point? What's the best way to do that?
So I haven't used a Jordan Drogue, but I have talked to a lot of people about it and did a bunch of research for this webinar. It seems to me, and when we rigged up the Sea Anchor, I got a little bit of experience with this. And with our drogue, it's just not, I haven't used it in severe weather, and it's not a powerful enough drogue to really feel like it's going to rip the cleats off the boat. We tend to lead it right to the winches, but I don't think that's the way you'd want to use a Jordan Drogue in heavy weather. So Jeannie writes about how she leads hers to massive cleats she added to the boat just for that purpose, and also leads it through a snubber line, like a shock absorber line, in addition to the shock absorber that's on the drogue itself. So it has a bridle, and it sort of leads to big solid cleats on our stern deck that have what look like the shock absorbers that you see for some people rig up on dock lines when they're in really rolly docks, those rubber leaders that you thread your line through. So I think you have to be prepared for it to have tremendous loads on it. And then you have to be able to transfer it to the winch to be able to get it in. They have a trip line on them, and that line's got to be able to be led to the winch to retrieve it. Retrieving them is a real problem. Retrieving that sea anchor of ours on that Hylas 49 was an unbelievable hassle. While we're on the subject real quickly, the reason that I'm not a huge drogue and sea anchor fan is that I just don't like the idea of putting all of that line overboard in extreme weather, because essentially you can find yourself getting kind of overrunning it and then suddenly having that line close to the rudder. The rudder is the key to your life offshore sailing. If you lose the rudder, you basically are at the mercy of the sea. And the idea of wrapping something around the rudder, which is really easy to do, just strikes me as a really bad idea. And suddenly you have created a real bad situation out of a situation that probably didn't really require it. So other than if you're in a boat that has no ability to heave to, or you're in a multi-hull, to me, setting a drogue is a real survival situation as opposed to a strategy, because I just am not very comfortable. And it's interesting because Skip Novak, who does all his on pelagic down off the Horn, he has exactly the same philosophy, that the idea of getting the rudder embroiled in a bunch of lines that are, as you're flailing around in a strong wind, just really strikes me as everything in my brain. I just feel my radar going up as a delivery captain and an ocean sailor, that you're just kind of navigating into an area that is going to be tricky. So I say you go down that road with a full awareness that you've got to really be on top of that situation all the time, because suddenly you're in a trough. And I mean, you can be pounding upwind and suddenly you're in a trough and nothing's happening. And then this line is floating around there. So it's just something that you should practice with and be careful with, in my humble opinion, and secure them really, really well.
Okay, thank you. A series of fore-reaching questions, and then a question for me as well on the sketch you showed when discussing fore-reaching. So to start with, can you clarify how to choose the best tack when fore-reaching, and were you saying that the waves should be a greater angle off the bow than the wind? And then my question on the sketch, the sketch shows the boat in two positions, implying that the boat is turning into the wind, into the
Yes.
seas. Is that implying sort of scalloping upwind to avoid taking the seas on the beam?
Okay, that sketch is a little wonky. No, so to deconstruct the question, that's an awesome question. The thing is that fore-reaching comes in two basic flavors. One is when you felt like we in that storm where we couldn't stay hove to anymore. And for us at that point, there was no option really but to fore-reach to the southeast. So even though the sea state would have been better in the short term to fore-reach to the northeast, because the winds had come from the south, we had to just bite the bullet and blast into the seas. So the wind angle for us was opening up, but the sea angle was not. So that diagram is kind of trying to show that you can have it both ways. Sometimes you can be sailing at a closer wind angle and have a better sea state. Other times it's just the opposite. So we felt like we were literally sailing directly into the waves, although we were sailing more and more 45, 50, 55 degrees off the wind. Eventually the waves changed and leveled out for us, but it was a very rough ride for reaching. So in that case, the choice, the tack was chosen by the fact that I wanted to move away from the direction that the storm was going. Going the other tack would have just prolonged our misery for a bit, for sure, and also was taking us away from where we wanted to go. We had sea room on both tacks, so we had that luxury. So a lot of times you choose your tack based on sea room or lack thereof. Sometimes you just have no option but to choose a tack that's going to be less friendly punching into the seas. If you have sea room, and if you're lucky with the way the storm is moving, the ideal way to forereach is when you can have the wind relatively close aboard, say in the 50-degree range, but the seas are more in the 60 to 70-degree range. That little gap can just change the motion dramatically. So the diagram aside, that video of us forereaching, we're sailing pretty close to the wind. We're probably 55 degrees off, 50 off, but the seas are 60, 70, 75 degrees off. The wind was shifting. The wind was about to shift and the waves were letting us know that. So it isn't, it's one of those things forereaching that you just have to try it both ways. But this is where having a big picture of the weather is super helpful to you, because we knowing, and I just know hurricanes so well, having sailed in that part of the world my whole life, that the hurricane had to be moving east and probably northeast, and certainly wasn't going to be moving southeast. So to me, it was a no-brainer which way to forereach. But that's where having a big weather picture, you can say, well, this may not be the prettiest tack in the world, but it's going to be a whole lot better 12 hours from now going this way. And so that's kind of how that is chosen. Sometimes another advantage, another advantage of forereaching that I didn't mention, is that you don't usually have to do that scalloping, Bob. You, generally speaking, you set the boat up so it's sailing at a point of sail that almost all boats sail really well at. So a huge advantage of forereaching is that every type of self-steering in the world, whether it's an autopilot or wind vane, loves to sail 50 degrees off the wind. It's about the most natural place for all modern boats. So your self-steering gear typically works really well. When you run off or whatever, you're always worried that your self-steering gear is going to respond to a big wave you're surfing down. Whereas forereaching, it's just your boat is like, this is the way every modern boat's designed to sail, on a close reach. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, that helps. And your last few words there are a perfect segue to the next question. When you choose to run off, how deep do you want to sail?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So one of the lessons that we learned from that second storm story was how valuable the whisker pole is. And people think of it as a way just to keep the jib from flogging around. But I think it has a real critical part of heavy weather sailing, because if the jib is loading and unloading, it's in a gale, it's a vicious point loading on everything on the forestay, and on the general track blocks and all sorts of stuff. The whisker pole essentially eliminates that, and it also allows you to run deeper, even if it's just accidentally. So to answer the question, depending on the sea state, you want, on Quetzal, for example, we want to take the waves just forward of the quarter. So that oftentimes results in running off at 130, 140. When Giorgio and I were steering through that crazy Gulf Stream gale, we would literally, one of us would call out where the wave was, and we would try to just intersect it with the corner of the transom and the hull, and then steer down at big time. So it depends on the sea state almost entirely, but it becomes really clear where it's easier to steer than other places. One of the reasons I mentioned in all of these webinars is that you need to get time at the helm, because there's going to be a time when you cross an ocean when you need to steer your boat in a serious condition. And if you're doing it for the first time, it's going to be a steep learning curve.
Okay, thank you. A question here, I think not so much a storm question, but kind of a passage question overall. Do you go aloft underway? Is that a thing you do in the midst of a passage or just before a passage?
Well, yeah, generally just before. It's making me laugh because Nathan hauled Vivian up the mast just the other day, and I was suggesting to Taji that that's how we should do it, and she was not going for that. You know, it's like a lot of things. Yeah, we've had to go up the mast at sea plenty of times. And it's a serious operation. It's remarkable being at the top of a 65-foot mast, how much you feel like you're rolling. You feel like you can reach over and touch the water, even though you're probably moving 10 feet. Going up the mast at sea is tricky and really requires a lot of careful action, but sometimes you have to. I mean, what happened to us was the head sail, the shackle on the head sail, the splice chafed through and the head sail came tumbling down. And so the spin halyard, I didn't want to raise it on that. I could have for sure, but I just said, you know what? I'm going to pop up there and grab this and we'll fix it properly. So good crew to haul me up, good bosun's chair to go up in, but it's not something you do just to check the rig underway. Before every offshore passage, serious passage, it really is time well spent to go up the mast and have a look around for sure. Nathan and Vivian were just up their mast. Like I said the other day, they found one of the spreader tips needed a little rivet update. So that's the kind of thing you notice when you go up the stick. But underway, it's probably too risky to do it as a matter of maintenance and it's like a walkabout or a mastabout. You do it when you need to.
Beautiful. We got a complicated, multifaceted lightning question here that we're going to answer the bulk of in writing. But just one question for you. We've talked, a few hours here of storms. Storms come with lightning.
Yeah.
Do you do anything special? Do you just hope? What's your thought there?
The thing is that if you're kind of in squally weather, it's the beauty of radar, and if you're kind of, again, Nathan was just telling us how when they came up the bay, they could see these lightning storms, and they were able to just kind of heave to and wait it out, and then tuck in behind it, and you have that option a lot of times nowadays with radar. You can see where these storms are. Out to sea, you don't really have that option. Lightning can be a part of your life. And there's not that much you can do about it. You say to yourself, there's one tall metal thing around here and it's me. And you can try to lessen your impact by looking at radar and trying to deal with avoiding the heaviest rain and lightning sections. But basically it's just, it's just kind of scary. I don't really know. I always will tell the crew when we are in serious lightning storms to stay away from the mast and the rig. I like to use, even though it's dangerous, I'll use the autopilot because I don't want someone holding the wheel. Now we use the steering vane, which is better because we can turn all the electronics off. Lightning's terrifying. I had a personal incident where I got struck, and I obviously survived, but it has made me twitchy. I have to say, I kind of feel a little static electricity when lightning's even a long way away. But it's I don't know the answer to it. And then the follow-up question to that is, is your rig grounded or ungrounded? And again, I guess we'll answer that, Bob, when we answer all the questions. But
That's what all the rest of the question is, with more detail, etc.
Because
That will be much better to write.
yeah, Quetzal is grounded, but there are people who believe that's the wrong approach. And I think that a lot of boats that they think they're grounded, probably if they looked carefully at all their fittings, might not be as grounded as they think they are. But that gets into philosophy about being grounded or not. So anyway, we'll tear into that for sure.
Yep, that's a great question. Okay, one more question here.
All right.
David has a good question here. Do you use only your running back stays when you're using the staysail?
How did this guy crash our party?
Yeah, a special guest.
A
Yes.
special guest. We have a special guest. This is Steve. Yeah, Steve Sullivan is a great friend of ours and a great friend of Quetzal. And yeah, Bob, turn your camera on, and we'll let Steve be seen by the world. All right, there he is. Steve has a Baba 40 that he has gone from the Great Lakes to the ocean in several times. And you're looking good, Steve. Good to see you, brother. Oh, your mask, yeah. Nice. Well, you got to be safe there on Bob's boat. Anyway, Steve's a great friend of ours who has sailed all over in his Baba, and it's an impeccable boat for sure. So, all right, guys, we have stretched on and on here tonight. Sorry I talked so much. Really, this is the last webinar, and I see so many familiar names. I just can't thank everybody enough. Sorry that we can't answer all your questions, but we are going to answer them. This is going to be fun to put all this together. So stand by for that. And also remember that Captain's Hour is Monday, so there'll be more questions and answers and talk and chatting and all sorts of things and wine tasting and whatever. When we started the Seamanship webinar series, I had zero idea how it would go, whether we could pull it off technologically. And honestly, Taji, I joke she's the producer, but she pulled it all together. She dealt with all of you guys and got it all pulled together, created the slideshows. She was amazing, and you should take your camera on, Taji. Yeah, so she was amazing and really, really helpful. She's the new director of education at John Kretschmer Sailing. She's a teacher after all. But anyway, guys, million thanks for turning up. It's a lot of John Kretschmer talking you weathered. That's heavy weather in itself. And Nathan and Vivian, thanks for being here, guys. It's nice having you in the marina again. And Bob, you're the man. Really, it's fantastic. I don't know how we'd have done it without you. So million thanks, brother. And thanks to everybody. So we're going to make sure we get all the questions under control. And we will stay in touch. We've got some more. This went so well. We have other webinars up our sleeve. We're going to not do them immediately, give everybody a Zoom break, but we'll keep you posted. And you guys should all stay in touch with each other. It looks like there's a lot of people to go sailing with each other. There's crew. Honestly, I love the community that all of our sailing and workshops have made for people. Bob and I met on a trip. He signed up to come sailing with me when he was a young guy, and he didn't realize I was going to ruin his life. So anyway, with that, it's coming up on 11 o'clock. We'll see everybody. Please turn up on Monday for the Captain's Hour. So hasta la vista. Good sailing. Avoid storms, have fun, stay in touch with us, please. Consider sailing with us and with Nathan and Vivian. They have openings on their sched. Go to John Kretschmer Sailing. That's a Vivian and Taji design website. It's so much cooler than it used to be. And see all the stuff we have going. So cheers, thanks.
And I'll get those recordings out tomorrow.
Taji will have all the recordings out. Yep, we have a lot of work to do, but we're stoked to do it all. So thanks again. This is me signing out. Sayonara.
right?
I didn't
It's
end.
still recording.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's okay.
Yeah, because I want to make sure Bob gets them all.